Okay, well, good morning, everybody. It's now 9:30, so it's time for me to start day 2 of the stage 2 hearings into the examination of the South Tyneside local plan. Can I just check, can everybody hear me okay in the room today? We had a slight issue with speakers yesterday, but hopefully it's being amplified in the room and can be heard from those who will be watching this separately online. Good, so if you can hear me, just to introduce myself, my name's David Spencer. I'm a planning inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the South Tyneside local plan. This is the plan that was submitted in March 2025 and the plan upon which representations were made in early 2024. Hopefully everybody's here for this morning's session, which is to looking at the various housing policies within the submitted plan. We'll then this afternoon be looking at matter 9 in relation to policies on flood risk, water quality, climate change and general borough policies on health and air quality. Before I get into some of the further sort of introductory remarks and housekeeping, can I just confirm or clarify with the council, please, in terms of just general housekeeping requirements? Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. We're not expecting any fire alarms today, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way to the fire exit on the far side of the room and then to the far side of the hotel car park to await instruction from staff. The toilets are just in the corridor to the left outside of this room. And please note that our cable's taped to the floor, so please be careful when you're moving around the room not to trip on those. And if you have a car parked in the car park, please can you ensure you've entered your registration details at the devices at the hotel reception. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I check, is anybody here from the local press this morning? No. Okay, thank you. These sessions are being recorded and available as per the stage 1 hearing sessions to view at a later date online if people haven't been able to make the room or be here in person today. I will ask at the start of each session whether anybody wishes to make their own separate recording of these sessions. As I've said at various sessions, I'm being supported in this independent examination by the Programme Officer, which is Annette Feeney, who's over to my left. And Annette is your first port of call if you need any kind of assistance or have any queries regarding the examination. Annette will assist you with those, and if you need to find any of the kind of documentation that's been published as part of the examination. Annette is based in the building while we're sitting here for the stage 2 hearings. Otherwise, her details are on the examination website if you need to get in touch with her. We'll start shortly with in terms of the introductions for the Matter 7 session. As I said earlier, these sessions are being recorded, so I want to be seeking people to use the microphones that are placed around the table. And I'll ask people at the start of each session just to briefly introduce themselves so that people following the recording are aware who's participating. For today's session, just to let the room know, I am being observed by a couple of colleague inspectors who have come along to see proceedings today. So if you do, as you'll probably be aware, I'm not engaging with anybody outside of these discussions, other than Annette. So if you do see me speaking to anybody today, hopefully it's highly likely to be one of my colleague inspectors. I just want to assure the council and others in the room we are not discussing the details of this particular plan examination, and I'll just reassure everybody that the ultimate report that will be delivered will be solely my own work and my own thoughts. So just put that out there for people to be aware of that for today. Are there any initial questions in terms of just procedure and how these examination hearings work? I think looking around the table, with the exception of Councillor Stonehouse, I think most people have participated at the stage 1 hearings. So I think most of you are familiar with how these sessions work. But they are intended to be reasonably informal but structured discussions. I've published an agenda. It's been available now for some time. We're going to work through that agenda and various questions that I've got, principally for the council, but then to bring in other people to make their submissions. I should just also finally emphasise, whatever I hear in this room carries equal weight to whatever's been provided in writing to me previously, back in early 2024 when you made original representations, and then further in your supplementary statements. What I'm looking for as part of all of these discussions is to understand if there is a soundness issue with the plan, what that is, and whether there's a potential change that could be made that could address that particular issue. Okay, if there are no preliminary procedural questions or queries, we'll go straight into the first matter of today, which is matter 7. It's issue 1. I've described it as securing sustainable residential development, and we're going to be looking at a number of policies in the delivering a mix of homes chapter of the plan. We're not today going to be talking about policy SP16 or the windfall or density policies. They're going to be discussed tomorrow afternoon when we pick up matter 7 again. I would really describe the policies or the suite of policies we're looking at this morning as the kind of will be the development management policies that will intended to shape and guide housing developments across the borough, so they're not limited to one specific site or location necessarily. Generally, the evidence for this particular session has been relatively constant. The key documents are going to be the Strategic Housing Market Assessment. I've tried on the agenda to highlight where there are some additional documents that I think people need to be aware of. One will be the Houses in Multiple Occupation topic paper that the Council's prepared, and the Council's also undertaken a Gypsy Traveller accommodation assessment. And I also wanted people to be aware that the Council has done further viability testing since stage 1, or has published further material since the stage 1 session, which has looked at the issue of affordable housing in relation to first homes. So it would be helpful for me at this stage to understand who I'm going to be hearing from at this morning's session. So if I can turn to my right and start with the Council's team, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Paul Shadarevian, King's Counsel, acting for the Council.
I'm Deborah Lamb. I'm the Operations Manager for the Spatial Planning Team at South Tyneside Council.
Rachel Cooper, Senior Plan and Policy Officer at South Tyneside Council.
Good morning. I'm Anna Dixon. I'm the Senior Manager for Strategic Housing and Regulation at the Council.
Morning everyone, David Newham from CP Viability. I've undertaken the viability testing on behalf of the Council.
Morning, Chris Martin from the Home Builders Federation. So we're the main representative body for house builders in England and Wales.
Morning, I'm Dominic Waugh from Pegasus Group representing Bellway Homes.
Morning, Jack Conroy, Savills Planning, representing Laverick Hall Farm Limited and Durham Cathedral.
Good morning, Councillor Geraldine Kilgour from the Felgate and Hedworth Ward. Thank you.
Good morning, Mervyn Butler from the Claydon East Bolton Labour Party.
Good morning, I'm Dave Hutchinson from East Bolton Neighbourhood Forum.
Good morning, my name's Sue Stonehouse and I'm Councillor for Beacon and Bents.
Thank you, everybody. Now, I should probably have also just mentioned in the introduction, we're obviously sitting for a morning session this morning. I don't think it's necessarily going to take us through right till lunchtime, you might be pleased to hear, but if we need a mid-morning adjournment, just let you know there will be a break at a suitable point. So turning to my agenda then, please, and it's the first item, and it's the Council's approach to the loss, or the Council's approach to existing housing within the borough, set out at policy 15, and I raised a question at my MIQ 7.1. I would describe this as quite a kind of spatial policy. It's kind of setting out things for the Council and its kind of various partners in terms of what's it's seeking to do in terms of the quality of the housing stock within the borough. But in terms of one particular aspect, it's the final part of the policy, part 7, in relation to where proposals that would come forward that would result in a net loss of existing housing stock, whether the criteria that are set out in the policy are justified in terms of what the council wishes to seek. So if I invite the council to my MIQ 7.1 in terms of the justification for that final part of the policy, please.
Yeah, so the intention with that part of the policy was to ensure that where there's stock that doesn't meet kind of modern safety standards or accessibility or energy efficiency standards, then there is a mechanism there for that stock to be replaced. And obviously a net loss would not be ideal, but the policy kind of ensures that where there is going to be a net loss, that the development must demonstrate that that is kind of necessary, and it wouldn't be viable to sort of retrofit the existing stock or appropriate to kind of retain that stock. There is an element of demolitions factored into the trajectory which kind of supports that part of the policy.
Thank you. So from the council's perspective in this terms of this part of the policy, is it driven by or informed by, if I can call them, sort of environmental objectives in terms of ensuring you're not going to lose stock of a sufficient quality, or is it a more sort of potentially a character issue in terms of losing particular types of housing?
It's both essentially. So paragraph 2.9 in the Strategic Housing Market Assessment highlights that a number of dwellings in the borough are likely to fall beneath the minimum standards of decent homes, and that kind of captures, like you say, character and sort of other issues such as energy efficiency that feed into stock being decent and modern.
Thank you. So I'll let the council confer. No, you could.
Just give me 1 moment.
Yep.
Before Miss Feeney tells me off, I was simply going to identify that the criteria in policy statement is not in the alternative. It all has to be fulfilled. That's the first point. And the second point is it's important to identify that in criterion 3, the applicant would have to demonstrate that the locality and character of the surroundings are no longer appropriate for residential use. So the policy doesn't admit a straightforward loss of a dwelling or dwellings in these circumstances. There has to be that additional factor which has to be proven.
Thank you. And in terms of what the council wants to achieve, and we've heard it at other sessions, generally supply to meet the housing requirements is challenging. This is a plan that's, if found sound, is probably going to just about meet its housing requirement with potentially little or very little headroom. Is there a legitimacy to sort of any of the concerns that this policy could inhibit or prevent otherwise sustainable development that may see the loss of existing housing stock, where there could be overall a kind of a net uplift in the overall supply? Could it be applied, zealously to kind of inhibit or frustrate otherwise sustainable development? To policy 7.
Yeah, are you talking about residential development?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so as Mr. Shadaravian had pointed out, I think the policy is quite, that part of the policy is quite sort of rigid in what it would allow in terms of a net loss. And I think it's there to support genuine cases where, you know, there is sort of stock that is not suitable for use, and the only option really is to demolish and rebuild.
Thank you. And I think the council has referred me in its statement to a couple of examples in the borough recently where that has arisen. As you say, demolitions, an allowance is made for demolitions. I mean, is this a significant or widespread issue for the borough, or is this more an exception and largely I mean, I've been to other parts of the country where, you know, demolition of existing housing stock is a significant issue. I don't know in the case of South Tyneside whether that's largely worked its way through the system, and generally housing stock is by and large in a good condition. I don't know whether it's Mrs Dixon or Ms Cooper on that point, please.
Yes, I think you're correct in the fact that we have undertaken a number of housing renewal schemes over the years, and actually we're coming to the end of that programme now. I can't foresee significant demolition programmes occurring, certainly during the planning period.
Thank you. Before I move off item 1 on my agenda, are there any further points people wish to make in relation to policy 15 and existing homes? I don't think I've got any suggested modifications in front of me, so I'm going to move on from that particular policy. Thank you to the council. So item 2 is the policy framework in relation to houses in multiple occupation, often abbreviated to HMOs. I'm afraid one of the many abbreviations we're going to slip into. The plan presents at policy 16 the council's planning policy in relation to this particular issue. I've got a number of MIQs that were related to this. I think there were relatively few representations on this, but I understand it's not an issue unique to South Tyneside. I think a number of authorities are looking at this particular issue and what it means. Obviously, houses in multiple occupation, there's a differentiation to be made in terms of scale, in terms of small and larger units. Obviously, there are a lawful land use, and I think there's evidence, correct me if I'm wrong, from the council in terms of the SHMA, that there is a role for HMOs in meeting certain housing needs. But I think obviously the council wants through the plan to manage that in a way that's responsive to South Tyneside. So in terms of my MIQ 7.2, and I think turning to the council in the first instance, can I invite them to briefly set out why a specific policy on HMOs was considered necessary in South Tyneside? And as I referred to earlier, you've prepared a particular topic paper on this, which I think probably a reflection of the significance of the issue.
Yes, so the conclusion of the policy is very much to try and strike a balance between allowing appropriate HMOs in suitable locations, but also trying to seek to manage the concentrations of these uses and the potential impacts on the community and amenity for existing residents. It's recognised, as you mentioned, within the SHMA that there is a specific housing need within the borough, which HMOs can provide. We also acknowledge that this type of accommodation requires further consideration through the planning process, and therefore it's considered that a specific policy was needed within the plan to address the impacts which are commonly associated with HMOs. In section 3 of the topic paper, we have an overview of the HMO context, which as it was at the time of preparing the Regulation 19 local plan, it identifies that although there was a fairly low number of licensed HMOs in the borough at that time, the generally tend to be concentrated within the low top area within South Shields, which has historically always been the case due to the nature of the properties in that area. And that area has been subject to an Article 4 direction since 2014 in an attempt to manage HMOs in that area from that point. But as I say, the policy as a whole tries to strike a balance between ensuring there is acceptable development of these uses in appropriate areas, but also trying to manage those impacts as well.
Thank you. And just from the council's perspective, in terms of those kind of impacts or issues in relation to the HMOs that the council is seeking through the policy to manage in an appropriate way, is it a combination of amenity, living condition issues? Is there a character issue in terms of the nature of, probably looking in the first instance at Law Top, but we'll come on to whether there's a more sort of borough-wide issue.
Yeah, so the idea is to try and maintain balanced communities as sort of set out in the NPPF. All sections of the policy try to address amenity and character issues basically for residents of these users and also for the communities as well. You'll sort of notice within the policy that it's sort of there's two sort of key aims in terms of managing concentration of HMOs borough-wide and also within the low top, although there is a particular threshold for the low top area, concentration and taking the judgment on the mix of new development process of HMOs outside of that area is also considered and also in the supporting text. So that will be determined on a case-by-case basis. We also have introduced the sandwiching effect criteria as well, again, so that would basically restrict HMOs which would be either side of a residential property, and that's aimed to try and mitigate the immediate impact on residential properties, and also to help try and manage concentrations outside the low top area where it may not hit those sort of thresholds, but will sort of accommodate the immediate impact on residential properties.
Thank you for that. I mean, in terms of the policy itself, policy 16, I mean, it sets out a number of criteria in terms of how the council is going to look at HMO proposals. Probably sort of item two of my agenda in terms of the effectiveness of the policy. Criterion 1, so part 1, criterion 2 refers to kind of not resulting in an over-concentration in any one part of the borough or becoming the dominant dwelling type. Has the council kind of given thought to how it's going to make that assessment and how it will kind of monitor the policy? I mean, what would an over-concentration look like, or what would becoming the dominant development type kind of look like? I mean, they seem obviously very sort of inherently kind of requiring a degree of judgment, but when does that kind of judgment become reasonable? Has the council given thought to how it's going to kind of monitor the policy in that regard?
Yes, so the policy's been informed by the National HMO Lobby work that suggests that 10% of properties or 20% of the population is normally a tipping point for HMO dominance within a certain area. I think that's quite obvious within the low top threshold, but also would also be sort of a consideration through the DM process, I think, for looking at properties outside of that area as well. But also, again, there is sort of element of planning judgment that will be taking place, and like you said, they'll be determined on a side-by-side basis. In terms of monitoring, you'll be aware that there has been changes around HMOs in the borough since this plan was prepared. I think monitoring is going to be a key factor in terms of reviewing this policy going forward. I think we will be looking at sort of applications coming forward and monitoring the concentrations and spatial distribution of HMOs and seeing whether there is a need for a change to the policy, come review of the plan at a future date.
And presumably in terms of just general monitoring and performance of policies, I mean, if there were a trend of, I don't know, decisions being approved contrary to officer recommendation, or how things are performing at the appeals, things went to an appeal process, that would inform. I'm just mindful, I mean, HMOs can, as I said at the start, I mean, they are a lawful planning use, but they can be an emotive kind of subject. People have concerns, and I think there are, as you say, through kind of government guidance, or a kind of recognition around potential kind of clustering, but it's kind of just where the potential checks and balances, if the policy's applied potentially too vigorously against, as I say, what's a lawful planning use.
Inevitably, policies like this, which are intended to invoke the exercise of planning judgment at DM stage, give rise to quite a lot of attention. And in some cases, it's unavoidable. And this is one such case where that judgment has to be exercised. What the policy does is provide the basis for the exercise of that discretion, which is important. The effectiveness of the policy is something which can be monitored over time by looking at the results. But at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to formulate a policy like this, where you are dealing with various parts of the borough which may exhibit different tendencies over time, and where the impact of highly concentrated residential use does have an impact. It could have an impact in terms of parking, in terms of amenities of people who live in the area. Those are matters which have to be considered on their merits at the time the application is made.
Thank you. The third part of the policy, and Mrs. Lamb, you've referred to as the sandwiching effect, so resisting scenarios where a residential, I'm going to slip into planning jargon again, the C3, normal residential use ends up being bordered on both sides by HMO proposals or HMO uses. Is that something that's been informed by the evidence in terms of, you referred to the HMO or the HMO lobby, or is that something that a policy approach that the council itself has kind of developed and identified off its own bat in terms of coming up with that particular approach?
I don't think it's something that's identified by the HMO lobby, but it is an additional tool that we have in terms of being able to manage HMO users. Like I say, in the circumstances where a threshold, particularly in the low top, isn't met in terms of the number of HMOs within the 100-metre radius, but that could still result in 2 HMOs with a residential property in the middle. So it is an extra tool and a planning mechanism of trying to reduce those impacts. And so I thought it was important to do that, because although it might not be tipping the balance in terms of the wider area, it's those immediate impacts on residential properties that element of the policy is trying to address.
Thank you. And just in terms of the implementation and effectiveness of the policy, if somebody's coming forward with a proposal for an HMO, is there any way through the council, I mean, assume obviously HMOs are licensed, that an appellate, so an applicant can understand whether they're going to kind of potentially trigger this policy, or that sandwiching. Is there a way they know or can find out that there are HMOs in that vicinity?
I suppose the main route for that would be through pre-app advice from the council to get an understanding of what the plan considerations would be for a development proposal.
Thank you. And then in terms of dealing just with the last 2 points of the agenda on HMO together, as you mentioned, Ms Lamb, the policy then applies a particular approach to the law top area. I think based on the council's view, that is a cluster as we sit here now of this particular use. In terms of the potential kind of thresholds and percentages referred to, the policy refers to 10%. I think you mentioned there are potentially alternatives. Did the council look at, or as part of sustainability appraisal or kind of optioneering for the policy, whether there is an alternative policy threshold, whether it's 20% of properties, just to kind of understand the reasonableness and the effectiveness of going for the sort of the 10% figure, and then obviously then applying that within a 100-metre radius.
Yes, so the policy, like I've mentioned, is informed by the National HMO Lobby. There wasn't a specific sort of reasonable testing of options around this, as it was informed by that, and also sort of draws on other policies in other local authorities, local plans and SPD documents in terms of applying similar thresholds. We did do an exercise within the topic paper which looked at how the application of these thresholds could work within the law top area, and they are set out in Appendix 1. It shows that example 1.5 would already exceed the 10% threshold within the maps that are showing, but example 2, one more HMO in that area would exceed the 10% as well. So we felt that off that exercise that we did, it was showing that 10% seemed a reasonable amount. I think any lower would have been too restrictive. As we said, there is a need for these uses in the borough, and anything higher than that would have questioned the effectiveness of the policy, as we know there's already concentrations in that area, so 10% felt like the right percentage to go for in that circumstance.
Thank you for that. I appreciate there's kind of a balance needs to be struck. You obviously keep coming back to emphasising, you know, lawful land use, so it's any kind of control or regulation needs to be carefully kind of considered and have particular justification. And I'll again revisit those appendices, so thank you for that reference. In terms of the approach that's applied to law top, it may in particular circumstances not rule out further HMOs entirely, so there may be schemes that can progress through that policy framework. But is there a potential issue, or is this now manifesting itself that in implying a particular approach to law top, there's then potentially or could be a displacement effect, or the pressure for HMOs arises in other parts of the borough if there comes a point where, you know, the cluster has kind of reached its capacity in the law top area? And is that something you're seeing? And leading on from that, the council, I think, advised through a helpful note in October on, I think it's called Associated Matters Update, that the council has been thinking about a wider Article 4 direction. So perhaps if I invite.
Yes, that's right. So on the 19th of November last year, the Council took a Cabinet decision to approve the implementation of an immediate Article 4, which is borough-wide across South Tyneside, which requires any development proposal for a new HMO, regardless of size, would require planning permission. This is sort of on the back of sort of a growing sort of feeling that there are more HMOs occurring across the borough outside of the traditional low top area. So I say that was implemented in November last year, and I think as a result of that, I think we've got approximately 20 planning applications that we currently have, which are dealing with 4 HMOs at this point. So as I've sort of said, the policy was prepared at the time it was, and based on the evidence that we had at that time. So at that time, the evidence was a low top was the key area for HMOs in the borough, and that's why the policy was written as it was to specifically identify that area. But I think the policy does have sort of flexibility to deal with HMOs in other areas. It has that flexibility in terms of you know, dealing with concentrations outside of the area based on planning judgment on a site-by-site basis, and also the sandwiching effect as well. And it's also, I suppose, important to note that it's not just this policy will be in play in terms of determining plan applications. Will also be relevant highways policies, design policies, etc., which also help determine the plan application at that point in time.
Thank you. I hadn't perhaps appreciated, so that's an immediate imposition, it hasn't been a non-immediate, so there's been no, so it's not been subject to kind of consultation, it's in effect and in force now. Presumably that's, did you say the decision was made in was it 19th of November? So presumably there has been a kind of a period, if anybody wants to challenge that direction, that period has presumably now elapsed. Okay. I think you make the valid point, Mrs. Lamb. Obviously, I'm examining the plan as submitted and based on the evidence at that time. Before I sort of move off the HMO issue, I mean, given that kind of change in circumstance, is there any necessity or need for soundness reasons to amend the policy to refer to there is now a wider Article 4? Is it a case of, well, the policy needs to be specific and bespoke to the law top area, and the alternative is, notwithstanding there's a wider Article 4, the other parts of the policy would apply to that? I wasn't sure if the council would then want to say, well, part 2 also would apply to the new borough-wide Article 4.
I think we could make a change to the supporting text to make to highlight the fact this Article 4 is now in place, which obviously the current supporting text does not do that. I think in terms of limit 2 of the policy applying borough-wide, I think as we've talked about monitoring and going forward, we don't know what the concentrations are going to be like. Obviously, we say we've got a number of applications in, but we don't know what the outcome of those are going to be. So at the minute, we don't have the evidence still of the concentration levels as we do in the low top across the borough. So I think from our point of view, it would be very much a case of monitoring and seeing how this progresses going forward. And like I say, in next plan reviews, then if we feel we need to extend that would be the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. I think as I sit here now, so I'm looking at the wider plan. I don't recall many representations on this policy, although I appreciate it is a significant kind of local issue. I think given the circumstances in chat, I'm not sitting here now thinking instinctively that there's a main modification to the policy. I think if the council wants to provide sort of a factual update in terms of supporting text, that's probably helpful to the implementation of the plan. Again, I'm not sure I'm going to need to recommend that specifically for soundness, but when we come to the final session next week, I'm going to sort of just go through the kind of various changes. There will be the main modifications that I'll be looking to recommend, but there'll also be a separate schedule of things, reasonably the council could look to do. I think there's if it's genuinely a factual update, and it's something to assist users of the document in terms of bringing that to their attention. Probably falls more into a change that could be done without me necessarily having to recommend it. But I make a note of, I've made a note of that kind of factual change. As I say, I don't recall many representations on this policy. I see Councillor Kilgore, your nameplate is up. I'm going to generously allow the kind of discussion to widen if there's a particular point you wish to bring to my attention. And then Councillor, is it Stonehouse for the Green Party?
Thank you, sir. I think, you know, Mrs Lamb is very well spoken around the increase in applications, and I think certainly from my perspective I would like to see more detail that has now come to light around those concentrations that have if you like moved the problem because of the particular attention that was needed at the low top. So I think what we're finding now is that larger, older properties are at risk of such applications, and there have been many within the last few weeks really in the Jarrow and Hebburn area. And I really do think not strictly, I wouldn't rule it out as being unsound if it wasn't included, but I do think there needs to be some further detailed descriptors in the policy. And the reason I say that is that it mentions, so for example, on page 90 of the draft policy of 4.4 there, of policy 16, that should it not have a detrimental impact on amenities of surrounding properties by causing excessive noise and disturbance. And I know we're going into the detail, but unless you are examining that application, you can't assume that there's going to be disturbance and noise and, you know, an impact on amenity. And policy doesn't allow us to demonstrate that. It's more a learned something. It's a bit like a monitoring process. And I'll be honest, I don't want us to risk having a monitoring period, because I think the law top has already told us that we needed this policy. The article 4 that is borough-wide is only a temporary measure as well. So it's not permanent, is it? Is it? Because my understanding was it was going to be reviewed in 6 months. So I'd like some clarity on that. If it is permanent, that's great. But I think, I really do think we need to look at the sandwiching effect as well. So if we're looking at that 100-metre radius, so for example, you know, we've got a street of 5, I'll name Surrey Street. It's just been rejected or recommended refusal by officers. Very gratefully so we are as a community, for the right reasons. We believe that that row is very tiny, and to have even a sandwich of one on either side of the row of 5 or 6 or 7 properties would be an over concentration. So just to say that one either side of an individual family home would be too much, I don't think that goes far enough. And I think when you're looking at the size of the properties that, you know, are lending themselves to these applications, there aren't many of them in a row by virtue of their size. So if this Article 4 direction has changed, and I'm misunderstanding that, my understanding was that it was to come back for review. If that's been changed, that's great. But that, because of the permanency of that needs to be, in my opinion, reflected in order, because we're going to go somewhere down the line before we have an opportunity to formally amend this policy again. And I think it needs to be now, when we're realising the scattering of this impact of the low top policy as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor. So if I interpret that correctly, you want a kind of a more kind of stringent policy that goes further than what's before me in terms of policy 16, in terms of potentially restricting this use. The policy doesn't go far enough. So
I think it's more, I think it is appropriate, but I don't think by way of area, it goes far enough, so it does very much concentrate, and rightly so at the time, on the low top area. I think it needs to be really clear that this is borough-wide, and that it's not just a monitoring process, because if we get to a point, say a year down the line, and you know, Deborah there's just mentioned around 20 applications, that's a lot. You know, and that has come as a result of the low top being really, you know, strictly enforced. It is concerning. We've got some in kind of, you know, the narrow terraces, if you like, of Jarrow, and with the old Victorian buildings. We've got them kind of at either ends of one road. So I think we need to be really careful, and around as well, as you move on to the next policy, around, you know, residential accommodations such as, you know, nursing homes and children's homes and things like that. I think it all very much comes into the mix, and those areas lend themselves and are to new developments of extra care facilities and things like that. So we need to be really careful around the multiple occupancy of those various types of tenure. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just briefly come back to the council before I hear from Councillor Stonehouse? I'm not sure to the extent it kind of, I need to think about it in terms of plan soundness. But the recent Article 4 direction, its basis longevity, is it in effect permanent? The kind of review mechanisms that would be invoked?
It is a permanent Article 4, and the 6 months that's been mentioned is basically to confirm that the Article 4 is in place.
I see. I should brush up on my Article 4 legal knowledge. So there's so the decision is taken. The Article 4 direction is put in place, and then after 6 months, there's been no objections or no particular issue. It's effectively kind of confirmed with or without modification. Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the kind of the issues that have been advised, I mean, sort of indicated earlier whether the kind of the policy approach to law top would kind of lead to displacement, and whether that's something the policy is going to be effective in kind of dealing with. I suppose over time that will be further understood. Obviously there's not just this policy, there are other policies that apply to living conditions, people's amenities. In terms of the implementation of part 4 of the policy, I'm not quite sure I understand the point, but that seems to me one of sort of the cornerstones of kind of planning judgment is around kind of effects on people's living conditions. I don't know if the council's got a view on just how, you know, the potential effectiveness of that. It strikes me as a well recognised and understood kind of criteria.
Again, you have to provide the policy foundation for the exercise of that discretion. And it does that by reference to the issues of noise and disturbance. There's not much more one could do, because of course the circumstances would vary quite considerably between one example and another.
Thank you. Councillor Stonehouse next, please. If you use microphone to help.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, sir. We're talking about a balanced community here, okay? Now, on my discussion, I want to give some examples. I've been a councillor and a candidate for about 7 years around the Beach Road and my ward. So I really know quite a lot about the issues that permanent residents have had. So we'll start off by talking about the HMO properties. Now, the policy should not count the buildings at all, but the occupants. There are, you know, HMOs all over the town. One has actually 71 residents in it, but it's not in our ward. So in our ward, in Beach Road alone, now this is a chain of beautiful townhouses, you know. The history of the townhouse was the fact that affluent families, but later on it was converted into guest houses. Now the guest houses have depleted, obviously, and so the actual area has changed considerably. So, in Beach Road alone, there are 9 HMO public homes, totalling 98 adults. Supporting Lives, which are 5 properties in Beach Road for people facing homelessness, 50 adults. Pathways Care Group, which are 2 houses knocked in to 1, they have 22 adults. Tyne Housing, which is 55 Beach Road, and 7 Belgrave Terrace, which is 5 metres away from Beach Road. They have 21 adults. So in total, we have 17 HMOs, totaling 191 adults. Okay. So we have not put this proposal hastily. It's not a case of NIMBYism. It's a result of looking at the negative impacts on South Tyneside, which I will go through, and examining the problems behind the current planning methodology of HMOs. The 10% figure cannot hope to adequately meet this aim. The compromise we have settled on reducing the figure to 5% rather than the number of buildings, rather than asking for an entirely new methodology to be introduced, changing the figure from the number of buildings to the total number of residents, or tailoring it to demographic figures for the area. Overall, we agree with the general premise of Policy 16. This is that HMOs are problematic, that their planning and use needs to be further regulated. Our proposal is simply a more logical means of achieving this aim in a short time. Now, Beacon and Bens ward, my ward, as postcode NE33 and NE33-2. NE33 holds 85.5% of the licensed HMO occupants in the borough. NE33-2 holds 24%. Beach Road alone holds 17.5%. Now, for nearly 6 years, I've seen the issues on the wards deteriorate. I've seen brawls between residents from 2 separate HMOs. Some of these vulnerable residents have complex and mental needs and addictions. They do not have the support of staff or management, which is one of my issues as well. They are literally set out. They roam the building, the towns, and obviously they're angry. They've got no support. Some would intimidate residents in the town for money. They lie in the road, in Beach Road. I've actually seen this, high on drugs. Permission was granted to build an HMO next to a nursery, which later the nursery staff thankfully found drug paraphernalia in the play area. All these incidents have been reported by, either from the police or to the police. It's caused many residents to sell their homes at a loss just to get out of the area. They know that, if you live next to an HMO, your property goes down. The businesses are losing money from shoplifting, not to mention police hours. September 23, the residents asked South Tyneside Council to undertake a housing intensity study to confirm the number of HMO occupants in the ward. South Tyneside Council declined. The community have repeatedly asked South Tyneside Council to amend the HMO policy to stop granting permission for more HMOs to be built in the ward. Despite objections from the police, the residents and ourselves, the councillors, South Tyneside Council stated that there is nothing they can do as the Secretary of State will overturn the decision and South Tyneside Council will be fined. Our local MP, Emma Lowell, has raised an HMO petition showing the wider strength of feeling to stop the overload of HMO approval, strengthen the constituency. As it stands, Policy 16 is weak in legal terms. The topic paper is out of date. Policy 16 needs improvement in planning terms and where licensed HMO or exempt HMO, such as housing association style properties, will be included, given an annual increase of 21% in licensed HMOs over the last 3 years. So it's increasing. As of the 8th of July 23, 381 HMO max licensed occupants. As of the 15th of January, 18 months later, 539 occupants. On the 25th of September, we had 560 max licensed occupants. This equates to an annual increase of 21.7 or an average of 6.9 HMO additional licensed occupants per month, which translates to an average increase of 82 new licensed HMO occupants. On average, I believe the problem here, we have HMOs that actually have people who work that just can't get on the property ladder. That's not a problem, and we respect that, and we respect the people for looking after them. My issue is with a lot of the residents have got severe mental health or addictions. They need looking after. They're not looked after, but the people who have these HMOs, some of the HMOs, are laughing all the way to the bank. They're not given any support at all. Some of them, they are. So we need to find out these people who are not supporting them, and we need to have concierges in, we need to have 24/7 staff, and that would help and support them and also our residents. Now, the main, I'll keep talking about Beach Road because that is where the houses have been converted all the way along. Now, I gave stats there of licensed premises. I think we have a number, I don't have the number of unlicensed premises, but you can talk about the majority of Beach Road not being that lovely, pleasant drive down to the beach. It's just all people who need help. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to pick out a couple of the issues that have been raised there for the council's assistance, please. I've been invited there in terms of policy H16 that another way of looking at the issue would be on an occupancy basis in terms of the number of residents. I mean, I can see some practical difficulties or issues with such an approach. I appreciate small, in land use terms, obviously small HMOs, which is the use class that if there wasn't an Article 4 is generally, is it 3 to 6 persons, and then anything above that would need planning permission anyway as a larger HMO. I mean, my instinctive feel is occupancy would be very difficult to embed in a policy and kind of monitor effectively, given potential comings and goings and just fluidity in the occupancy of stock.
Yes, we would agree with that. We understand the issues, and it's with the greatest of respect that I think we must stick with the policy as it's drafted and the approach which has been taken as providing a sound basis for planning control.
And then Councillor Stonehouse also referred to, was there an alternative, say 5% as being, say, the threshold? We raised earlier that there are options potentially around 20 or 10%. I mean, is 5% in effect likely to result in a blanket ban when you go down to that kind of threshold?
Within the low top area, probably yes, it would be quite restrictive. Outside of that area, like I said, we don't have evidence for concentrations that would make a difference.
Now, the plan itself is applied to land use. That's its function and task. I think obviously Councillor Stonehouse has referred to other kind of issues. Presumably there are other regimes and other legislation that applies in terms of the management of the HMO stock. I appreciate some will be licensed and will be operating very effectively, but in terms of, I'm just thinking about the boundaries and scope of this document and what it can do versus, I'm probably looking at Mrs. Dixon in terms of more widely what the council can do in terms of this issue. Just very briefly, because I'm mindful we need to go on to other issues.
All we can do through this document is regulate land use in terms of the council's ability either to grant planning permission or to refuse planning permission, and to some extent deal with the way in which permissions are implemented and thereafter carried out. There's not much more we can do at this stage to regulate some of the issues which are commonplace and which have been referred to, which are the subject of other regimes, including the licensing regime and also common law regimes as well, which deal with matters of nuisance, for example.
Thank you. Has Mr. Shadravian covered what you were going to... I turned to you, Mrs. Dixon, but...
Yes, I mean, quite quickly, just to say that, yeah, obviously, from a wider council approach, in addition to the local plan and the planning policies that we're talking about, obviously we have other enforcement and support and strategies that would try and support some of the issues that Councillor Stonehouse has raised.
Thank you. I made a note of the particular points you raised there, Councillor Stonehouse. I'll reflect on them further. There are other issues other than HMOs we need to discuss this morning, but do you feel that you've said what you wanted to sort of bring to my attention this morning?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Yes, we suggested the 5% rule for the low top. That's fair enough. But in hindsight, I would not like a repeat of these issues whereby the residents are not thought about. It's all money. It's where can we put these people in, and that will be fine. But it's the impact that these people have and the impact that they're not getting the support they require. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you for that. If there's nothing further then on HMOs, I'm going to move on in terms of the agenda. It's item 3, housing for older people. Obviously, the National Planning Policy Framework requires planning to consider the needs of different groups in the community, including older persons. Often brought to my attention at other appeal casework that the planning practice guidance talks about the need of older persons housing being critical. obviously we live in a time of an ageing population. It's probably likely that older age cohorts are going to kind of grow over the plan period, and therefore is there going to be an effective kind of policy framework that's going to help meet the needs of older persons. That was my MIQ 7.5. It's picked up at policy 17 in terms of the plan itself. So if I can turn to the council first in terms of the effectiveness of policy 17 supporting proposals for older persons accommodation when they come forward, please.
Yeah, so the SHMAR clearly evidences a need and a demand for specialist and adaptable housing, and it highlights an increasing need for residential care bed spaces, extra care units and specialist older persons accommodation. Policy 17 aims to meet that housing need by supporting extra care and supported housing coming forward sort of in the right locations, in sustainable locations, and where they can integrate into the residential community. And it sort of ensures that, sorry, just distracted, where that those developments come forward, that they're in the right place, they've got access to community facilities, to sustainable and accessible public transport.
Thank you. Is anybody else struggling to hit with this? I mean, I don't know what...
It seems to be getting louder.
Yeah, obviously having too much fun next door.
Sorry, I have spoken, well, the team has spoken with reception.
I think we're about an hour or so in. It's probably slightly earlier than I was anticipating taking a break, but I think I'm being distracted as well by the volume of noise, and presumably people who are sitting on the back row are probably more exposed to what's going on behind you than we are out here. So what I'm going to suggest is if we take the mid-morning adjournment slightly earlier, it's coming up to 25 to 11. If I can ask people to be back in this room at 10 to, and hopefully that will give the hotel sufficient time to seal us in. Thank you. Okay, it's 10 to 11, so time to resume this hearing into the examination of the South Tyneside local plan. I understand we are now soundproofed and sealed in to this room, so hopefully people can kind of follow the proceedings both online and in the room. So thank you for getting that resolved. Before we took the break, we just started the discussion on item 3 of the agenda, housing for older people, and I'd heard from the council in terms of their view on the effectiveness of policy 17 in the plan on specialist housing, extra care and supported housing. In terms of the scope or the remit of this policy for the council, before I bring in other people, is it intended, I mean, older persons housing can cover a vast spectrum of kind of house types, can often be a knotty issue as to whether something falls within a residential use, or whether it's in the kind of the extra care institutional type land use. The way I'm looking at this policy, I can certainly see it applying more towards the kind of the extra care, more supported living kind of spectrum. Is it a policy that would also be intended to apply to those who are coming forward with, say, what are commonly described as kind of retirement living schemes? So there might be an age occupancy condition, and there may be an element of on-site kind of support or an on-site manager. Is it intended to also apply to that type of development?
Yeah, so the policy is intended to support any type of specialist housing or supported housing, so whether that's on a wider residential scheme or a specific extra care scheme.
Excuse me. In terms of my agenda and the MIQ 7.6, and then I will bring in other people. We discussed this also yesterday when we were looking at specific site delivery. So the plan makes some positive identification in terms of allocations for older persons accommodation at various sites. And I think I heard yesterday they're now, most of those are now actually coming to fruition fairly quickly. Obviously that's part of the potential delivery. Are there any other sites or areas that the council's kind of positively identified, or any of the other allocations anticipated to bring forward an element of specialist housing provision?
So as the plan was being prepared, the 3 sites that are identified in the plan has been for extra care, were the only sites that are sort of specifically identified. But as we picked up on yesterday, a lot of the sites in SP4 are council owned, so that's not to say that they can't come forward for that type of use or they won't come forward. I think, you know, we've seen that the apartments at Tutor Reed have got permission, and apartments at Hebburn Newtown, and I think that just shows that the council does work proactively to bring these sites forward.
And in terms of delivery, I mean, it's as you referred to, Ms. Cooper, I mean, the council could have control over certain sites, particularly if it's in its ownership. In my experience, a lot of older persons housing comes forward from the market. They tend to prefer, not exclusively, but certainly will take on kind of windfall sites that they want to see redeveloped. My reading of the policy, there's nothing to preclude if somebody came forward with a scheme on one of the allocated sites within the plan for housing that would, as I say, stop or prevent an older person's housing scheme being part of that, and presumably subject to the precise form it takes, contributing positively to the overall housing numbers.
If a proposal came forward on one of the allocated sites, housing sites, this policy would support that.
Thank you. If I can bring in other people on this, I'm going to start with, on my left, the East Bolden community. I'll start with Mr. Hutchison and then Mr. Butler in terms of your representations, and I think you are seeking a sort of a positive identification or a positive allowance for kind of older persons housing within your community?
Yes, thank you, sir. That's correct. I'd like to start, though, by making a general point that was put forward by the Fabian Society in a document called A Vision of Ageing at Home, which I think sets, an interesting background for what we're discussing this morning. The report stated that building the right homes in the right places helps people to live independently for longer. More suitable housing delays the onset of care needs and at the same time as promoting independence. Building the right homes in the right places by offering more appropriate new build options frees up existing housing, very often larger properties much sought after by younger families. Increasing the proportion of older owner-occupiers who move each year has many benefits. However, if this is to be achieved, not only must there be suitable new build options, but those properties must be built where people actually want them. Very often this will be within their existing community where they have family ties and friendships. And that's why ensuring that suitable accommodation for the elderly is directed to where it is needed on a site-by-site basis is so important. Now, to specifically respond to your question in relation to paragraph 7.11, the South Tyneside 2023 Strategic Housing Market Assessment report, in its final comments, identifies that ensuring that housing and support needs of older people are met going forward as one of the three main challenges. And I think that's a really important point, and it's key to the whole issue that we're debating this morning. The report provides a clear evidence base for the type of housing required and the scope of the provision needed for older people. Paragraph 8 of the draft local plan identifies the difficulties that the local authority has. This says, while most of the development within the planned period will be carried out by private developers, it is still important that an appropriate mix of housing is developed to meet the housing need. East Bolton Forum contends that while policies 17 and 19 are very well intentioned, without further amendment, they will be ineffective in meeting the challenge identified by the Strategic Housing Market Assessment. It will not secure the identified housing need for the elderly. The Council's response to the Inspector's question 7.5 and 7.6 does not demonstrate how the extent of need that is being identified will be met in a tangible way. It provides more of a general approach to this issue. Planning practice guidance is also very clear when it addresses this question. And again, I'm quoting here, do plans need to allocate sites for specialist housing for older people? It states, it is up to the planning making body to decide whether to allocate sites for specialist housing for older people. Allocating sites can provide greater certainty for developers and encourage the provision of sites in suitable locations. It adds, this may be appropriate where there is an identified unmet need for specialist housing. East Bolton Forum believes that policies 17 and 19 need to be amended so that they are more directional and signal where and what is needed. Policy 19, for example, could include the requirement that accommodation for the elderly be provided as identified in policies listed under the strategic allocations. In its Regulation 19 response, East Bolton Forum suggested that policy SP7 be expanded to include the identification of suitable sites where appropriate accommodation for the elderly could be provided, and this be included as a key consideration for the respective site. In its statement to the Inspector, the Forum's made the point that evidence seems to suggest that windfall sites are becoming smaller, and it's the case that these sites tend to be in areas where the council owns housing stock or the land. In areas such as Cleed and East Bolton, it's unlikely that opportunities will present themselves which would allow specialist housing to come forward by this means, and therefore the sites identified in the local plan represent the best and perhaps only chance of addressing the identified need. Now, finally, to answer your specific question 3.3, the Forum argues that specific provision for older persons housing is needed in East Bolton and could be provided on site GA2 land at North Farm. Thank you.
Thank you. I will hear from Mr Butler next and then bring some of those points back to the Council. Mr Butler, please.
Thank you, sir. In the response from the Green East Bolton Labour Party to Policy 19, we considered that it did not meet identified needs for the accommodation of older people in the borough, and we believe that it is our view that this also applies to Policy 17. You've directed us to paragraph 62 of the MPPF, and we've also had reference to the planning policy guidance. It's clear to us that the plan is not doing enough to provide accommodation for older people. The evidence in the strategic housing market assessment is clear. At table 5.4, it sets out an assessment of need of different types of older persons accommodation. In total, it recognises the projected shortfall of 3,361 units across all classes of accommodation for the elderly by 2040. There's a real unmet need in this borough, and we believe that it should be looked at further. In terms of our own ward, we have a number of what you've termed retirement living schemes which are successful. They have very few vacancies. Two of them in East Bolton are very close to the metro station and the shopping area. Yet we found with the proposed developers at Cleedon Lane that we could not persuade them in our consultation with them to look at provision for older people, despite the evidence of successful schemes nearby. And in answer, again, to your question, we believe that the site there, and if you do allocate the site at North Farm, that provision for older persons accommodation should very much be part of the key consideration. And we don't feel the Council is doing enough to direct the market towards this area. You've heard the benefits of bringing forward accommodation. People in the older population look to downsize and release their larger properties for family use. This helps the housing problem in the borough. So from those points of view, we don't consider Policy 17 to be effective, justified or positively prepared as it stands, and we'd like to see those amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring in others shortly, but I can turn to the Council on some of those points that have been raised, that were raised in respective kind of statements and original representations. And I appreciate, notwithstanding what I heard at stage one hearings about concerns about the proposed allocations at East Bolton and Cleedon, if those sites were to go forward, could there be a more positive approach in terms of what could be provided on those sites from the perspective of kind of local communities in terms of a modification to identify within the key considerations for those, certainly for the Bolton site, something that reflected the need for older persons accommodation. Would that be necessary for soundness?
The Council considers that policies 17, 19 and 20 all kind of work together to ensure that older persons accommodation and accessible accommodation will be delivered where it's needed on a sort of site-by-site basis. So we don't consider it necessary for soundness to include that in the key considerations. I think those policies are quite strong, especially when they're looked at together.
Thank you. I mean, the Council's approach to some extent reflects the kind of national planning policies I've been referred to in terms of, you know, considering whether sites should be allocated, and some have, where the council's in control. One of the other modifications that's been suggested to me in that exchange is perhaps a sort of more direct cross-reference or signpost within either policy 19, potentially policy 17, that the proposed allocations within the plan could be, I appreciate the council might tell me it's kind of in there anyway, and it would be, you know, one of the allocations in the plan would invariably meet all the criteria, or certainly the criterion part 1 of policy 17, but whether it would be necessary or effective to kind of have a more kind of overt cross-reference to say the site allocations in the plan are an opportunity to make provision for some of this identified need.
I think in terms of the key considerations, we were obviously mindful not to just repeat the policies that are already in the plan, and sort of look at site-specific issues such as, you know, flood risk. So I don't think we'd sort of wanted to go down the road of just putting in key considerations that are already picked up within the policies elsewhere in the plan.
I wondered if it was more from what I'm hearing from the forum and from the Labour Party. Obviously, they're, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think their sort of sequence is they would like to see something within policy GA2 for Bolden, or potentially GA4 for Clevedon, around this is provision of older persons housing will be one of the key considerations, and I think I hear from the council, well, we don't need to do that for soundness, there are other policies. There's the other way of looking at it under policy 17 to say, you know, explicitly we would support, if it came forward, subject to obviously all the other kind of policy criteria, but nonetheless we would positively support older persons accommodation as part of the mix of housing on any of the kind of the allocated sites.
I think a modification like that could be introduced without the necessity actually to identify that particular use within the allocations itself. We could do that. And that would also provide a degree of discretion as to the amount to be brought forward on those sites, the number of developments of that type to be brought forward on those sites, rather than trying to ascertain what it might be at this stage. So we could certainly do that. And that could actually be incorporated into either policy 17 or 19. So let us give it some thought. I'm not going to volunteer a mod at this moment, but let's give that some thought.
The point was put to me, I mean, policy 17, and I referred to kind of, you know, this kind of provision has historically come forward through sort of the windfall route. I think the point that's been put to me is, and I think this is an issue for this plan in the particular circumstances, that windfall, given the kind of various other factors, is perhaps not as generous as it could be in other locations in terms of how can housing be delivered outside of potential allocations. I think we kind of have various sessions now. I think it was referenced yesterday, you know, the council, to quote Mr. Ayrton, has kind of squeezed the pips of kind of what you can get out of the main kind of urban areas. It's kind of what tools are left, and it does seem that the allocations are one potential avenue that's available. So I think I am looking to the council for something that kind of signpost.
And I think, having regard to the fact that the allocations are being identified as a means of moving this forward, policy 19 would be the better policy in which to deal with that.
Thank you. Mr. Butler again, please.
Yes, thank you, sir, and thank you for that direction, and thank you to the council for being able to now have some flexibility. I think our communities feel that if they're going to have the amount of housing brought to them that this plan would allocate, and we're talking here of 420 houses in the ward, and then we have the issue of what happens with Clevedon Lane as well, the type of housing that the market at the moment wants to bring to communities doesn't reflect the need in the communities, and therefore we want to see more direction taken. And I think if it can be done via this policy, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can bring in others now. So Mr. Martin with a new hat, I think.
Yes, sir. I think as the HBF, we do support housing that meets the needs of the elderly. But I think if you start directing specific requirements for the elderly to existing allocations, it could have a bit more of an outsized effect than anticipated, because it may well change overall site capacities. It could be viability implications, because you're talking about a slightly different product here. And if you've got a plan where the headroom is quite limited in terms of the requirements versus the allocations and the other sources of supply, any change in things like site capacities could be quite detrimental to the plan being able to meet its needs over the period. I think really the PPG is quite clear on this, that if there's a need for this type of housing, it should be specific sites should be identified for that specific use. And that will provide greater certainty for those developers to bring those sites forward. I think putting them into an existing allocation could create deliverability issues with those operators. So it would be something, a policy I think that would facilitate potentially elderly accommodation, would add flexibility, but mandating it on certain sites I think could be quite problematic.
Thank you. I mean, I wasn't thinking around the lines of potentially mandating. It's just a signal that if somebody did come forward on one of the allocated sites and felt, well, we've looked at the situation, maybe they've spoken as part of pre-app or initial discussions to East Bolton and other communities, and there's a real sense that there's a scheme here that could include an element of specialist housing as an extra layer somewhere within the plan that would say, you know, there would be a policy to support that. I'm slightly curious about this point that it might affect site capacities and overall viability. Obviously, older persons' accommodation can be built in a kind of a relatively kind of dense form. It may provide another kind of revenue stream for that particular site. You might be closer to kind of site and development economics, but my instinct was it may not necessarily harm site delivery numbers or viability.
It depends, doesn't it? Because I mean, as we've mentioned earlier, the elderly accommodation is a wide spectrum. If you've got specific house types like that are there for elderly people, that could be things like bungalows, which are a lot more land hungry than, for instance, a house. If you're building some flats, normal residential flats, you would probably be able to get more in there than ones that are specific for elderly people, because they tend to need to be a bit larger to accommodate the needs of those people. So it fundamentally, it can change quite dramatically how a site works and how a site functions. And in viability terms, you're sort of narrowing the market as the kind of people who might well take up those units. So it's a difficult one, and it's one that I think could be quite detrimental to the plan. But yeah, it was an answer to the 7.6, because I know it's mentioned about putting it on allocated sites. So as I said, our view was, I think a policy to facilitate elderly accommodation. I think that's has its merits, and I don't think there's necessarily anything in the plan that would prevent an operator doing that anyway. But putting that clarity in is good. It's just the make it, you know, insisting that a certain percentage, for instance, is on the site would be something we couldn't support.
Thank you. Understood. Come back to Mr. Butler, and then I will bring in Councillor Kilgore.
Housing mix, sorry, I can't agree with Mr. Martin about this situation. We're going to come on to discuss the housing mix later. But we can have a situation, certainly take your point on density. I mean, we're looking at the type of retirement apartment blocks that we have in the ward, 3-storey, high density. Yes, they require some landscaping and parking around them. And I would direct anyone to look at a scheme at the Close in Borden Lane, Clevedon, where you have very good types of housing alongside this apartment block, and the scheme works very well indeed, and I can't see the reason why the development industry isn't looking at this type of thing. They're single-minded in looking at their type of family executive housing and not looking at the requirements of the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kilgore next, please.
Thank you, sir. I couldn't agree more with my colleagues to the right there. I think SP8 does not tick any of the boxes that we're looking at in these subsequent policies this morning. With regards to older persons accommodation, we've seen the need in the draft local plan and the mention of, you know, how many residents we have, 70, you know, years and over. There is no provision in that site, and actually, you know, to be quite bold about it, I would like to see some mandation. I'm not so sure how we could do that, but I don't think it is strong enough to facilitate the needs of the housing, of the demand for our communities, and certainly not to the detriment of losing green belt space as a result of that. If we look at the policies as we go through, and I know Mr. Butler's mentioned about the housing type and tenure, etc., there is a huge railing against on SP8 to meet the 25% affordable housing, let alone the looking at the accommodation with regards to wheelchair access for the first homes, etc., etc. So I would absolutely welcome further mandation on that. We can't have a local plan that's fit for the future if it doesn't recognise the needs of now and the future. And unfortunately, site SP8 does not recognise that need at all, in my opinion, and it doesn't promote inclusivity. You can't have bespoke elements of a site, particularly that large, whereas, you know, the shopping area is in a distinct area, the hub, if you like, is on the edge of that provision. It's not inclusive, it's not opened up. We see developments like this all of the time, where the affordable rent and the affordable to buy are in separate parts of those estates. They are distinctive, they are not inclusive, they are not collective, and I don't think in any which way, shape or form, this should be also allowed to be devolved by way of 106 monies. I think the need is categorically there. We see also the need of residents wanting to remain at home, so not necessarily in specialist accommodation, but maybe remain in their own home on a development. We need to be able to facilitate that by way of accessibility. It mentions as well about the 20% of vacancies in residential care and nursing care. We need to be providing accommodation not only of that nature to a high spec, but also to the individual homes. And yes, I understand bungalows are land hungry, but this is about the need of the community and not profit. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring in Mr. Conroy, and then I'll hear from others, please. I'll go back to the council.
Thank you, sir. I think there was a slight conflation there between discussing housing for older people and then slightly verging into affordable housing, which I'll park that matter for now, and we'll discuss that in matter 4 shortly. Just turning to the points raised by Councillor Kilgour, I just raised that criterion 5 part I of SP8 does make reference to the provision of a wider mix of house types and sizes, and then there is explicit reference to policies 19 and 20 within policy SP8 there. Now, of course, when an application does come forward on SP8 in the future, that application would not simply be assessed against SP8. Of course, it would be assessed against a wider range of DM policies. So we consider the wording that is currently in SP8 to be sufficient and flexible enough to allow for changes to future need, which may come forward as part of future SHMAs, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. And discussing with the council a moment ago, a potential modification that they're going to go away and think about in terms of within, I think the council's looking potentially at policy 19, sort of a cross-reference back, that if a proposal comes forward that contains an element of older persons housing, it will be supported on particular sites, if that's part of an appropriate kind of mix for that site. I mentioned kind of just loosely allocations. I probably had in my mind the sites that are in SP7 and SP7A and SP8 in terms of the larger Greenfield
your
sites.
comments have just reflected something I've just discussed. Thank you. So what's going through my mind at the moment is a modification to policy 19 for the reasons I've already expressed, by adding a further criterion at the bottom of that policy. It would need refinement and would need also further consideration to consider what the implications of it might be. But a provision which provides that in relation to accommodation for the elderly, including the provision of extra care accommodation, such accommodation will be encouraged on sites allocated in the plan, and again, we can actually focus that if we need to in the plan for residential development, even if the notional dwelling capacity of the allocated site, this is important, is higher than indicated in the relevant policy. I'll explain why I've put that in. And the criteria of policy 17 and other relevant policies in the plan are satisfied. The reason I put that in, of course, is because the density implications of including extra care, for example, might push the number up beyond the notional capacity as identified in the allocation. And we don't want that to act as some kind of unnecessary restriction in circumstances where the additional dwellings would be acceptable. So that's what we're thinking about at the moment, but it needs a bit of refinement. We need to think it through. So I can't, on behalf of the local planning authority, make any promises about it, but it's a way forward.
Thank you. Mr. Conroy, you're looking quizzical.
Thank you, sir. We'd be encouraged to see any draft wording that the council will put forward, I assume, as part of a modification to policy 19 in that respect. Again, I'd be slightly cautious to mandate a requirement, particularly within SP8, as you'll be aware, being the largest allocation in the plan, being a phased allocation which is going to come forward over a number of years, to mandate an exact amount at this stage when this site may be 10, 15 years in the making. We feel that would be unduly prescriptive and arguably unjustified. And as my colleague Mr. Martin points out, there may be associated viability constraints, delays to the preparation and the future adoption of the plan in that respect, which, given we're at stage 2, I'm sure we're all keen to avoid. So for that reason, I think the wording is sufficient for the time being.
Thank you. I mean, there were viability has been raised a couple of times. Mr. Newham, you had your nameplate up a while ago. I don't know if the moment's passed and it's kind of, whether there's just a brief point you wanted to bring in on this particular issue.
Yeah, it was the word viability. It sort of stirred me. It was really just to make the point that in the original viability testing from December 2021, there was some viability testing done for retirement apartments. That was factored into the modelling, and it did show some positive viability outcomes. Again, it depended on the assumptions, which we'll go into shortly, I'm sure. But it was just if that was helpful from your perspective.
Just keen to move the discussion along, so if it's a brief point again, Councillor Kilgour.
Thank you, sir. I would just refer back to the response from Savills at Matter 7 with regards to the real problems that they seem to suggest about viability on providing the 25% affordable housing, let alone any other provision. And of course, we're looking at not only older persons accommodation, but specialist accommodation by way of children's homes and children's facilities and things like that. So it's much broader than that. And I think we absolutely do need to see a requirement, particularly on a scale of 1,200 homes, you know, mooted for that particular site. And I would just, you know, ask, sir, that you look at again, which I know you will have digested, the statement from Savills on that around all of the different viability concerns that they have at this very late stage, and there has to be room for consideration of those very much needed. It's got to be fit for purpose, and I'm afraid it's not fit for purpose if it's structured around unaffordable homes of a certain type that doesn't meet the criteria that could well be mitigated by a 106 agreement that doesn't have the infrastructure, or that is not inclusive.
Okay, we're probably sort of slightly widening out from probably where I wanted to be for this session. So hold those thoughts. We're obviously going to pick up Felgate tomorrow morning, and there'll be an issue around, I think the final point on that is around deliverability. We've also got plan viability discussion more generally next week as part of the final week, and I suspect it will also be raised on Friday when we look at infrastructure. Councillor Kilgour did raise a further point that I do want to pick up in terms of the final part of Policy 17 in terms of accommodation, seeking to deliver and promote independent living. I mean, my understanding was there's very much a kind of a sequence that policies beyond planning will seek to kind of encourage and enable people to live at home and independently for as long as possible. The way I'd read Policy 2, so criterion 2 of Policy 17, is that if people want to adapt and amend their properties, there's generally a positive framework to do that. I think there was a slight concern, I think, in some of the representations that the final part of Policy 2 could be used to secure developer contributions for that aim and objective in terms of if there's any kind of programme to adapt existing homes. Turn to the Council in the first instance in terms of, have I read the final part of Policy 2 as kind of the final criterion 2 of Policy 17 being about supporting people to adapt their homes, or is the Council looking at developer contributions?
Sorry, no, you're correct in assuming the policy is sort of seeking to promote people adapting their homes or development providing adaptable homes on site.
Thank you. Are there any further points people wish to raise on Policy 17 before I move on? No. In which case, come to Policy 18, it's affordable housing, item 4 on the agenda. The Council's put forward a policy that sets out various requirements. I think as a starting point, in terms of where the policy or the thresholds upon which the policy is seeking provision accord with national planning policy. It's probably part 3 of the policy that introduces the more kind of local aspect or flavour to this this policy. And I just ask from the council in follow-up to my MOQs 7.7 and 7.8 as to whether policy 18 strikes the kind of the appropriate balance when looking at the need for affordable housing, viability, considerations, that it's going to support wider housing delivery and an appropriate level of affordable housing by these different areas, which I assume reflect kind of market values across the borough. So if we can invite the council first, whether it's Mr. Newham or...
Yeah,
yep.
I'll jump in if that's okay. So yeah, there's two elements really to this for consideration from my perspective, and that is first about the splitting the areas into different value zones. So that's one part of this, and then the second part, which is your MIQ 7.8, are the level of those affordable housing provisions, are they suitable? Before I answer both of those, I just wanted to give an overview to yourself and to everyone in the room about the viability testing process and what it involves, and I'll try and be very quick, and I know this can be quite detailed. But the first thing to just stress, the approach involves primarily typology testing. That's what we have to look at. So we cannot test every single site that's obviously going to come forward in the future. We have to make an assumption about the type of development that is likely to come forward. So we're making a reasonable judgment as to what those typologies include. For example, we've looked at a site of 30 dwellings. We've looked at a development of 80 dwellings. So we've tried to change the typologies reflective of quantum. So have that in your mind. The second point is that the viability review process itself is iterative. So we start at, we make assumptions, we engage with stakeholders, and we move through the process, and we make what we consider to be reasonable adjustments as we go through the process. So the initial viability testing as part of this wider process, the plan viability testing, dates back to December 2021, and that's PRE 25 in the library. So that's the first stab at viability, if you like. And when I say stab, I mean a bit flippantly, because it was a 100-odd page report. So there's a lot of detail in there. The other point to make, so I'm sorry, just going back. So 2021, we did some testing, updated in 2023. And then, as the inspector stated from the outset, we've also done some testing in 2025 after the initial stage 1 examination. The third point just to make is that any viability testing, any valuation exercise is a snapshot in time. So it's reflective of the market conditions at that point. We cannot predict the future in terms of whether the market will get better or worse. We have to reflect what's on the ground at that moment in time. And that, again, that's really important to have in your mind. There are market challenges out there at the moment, and there have been for a few years now. So that is in the back of the council's mind when they're looking to set policy. Clearly, an affordable housing policy has to be deliverable and justified, but it also cannot be set too high and cannot be set too low. It has to be reasonably balanced over the lifetime of the plan. So that was, again, something to bear in mind. The other point I just wanted to make before I answer the two elements of the questions, the assumptions that go into the viability testing have to be reasonable, and they have to be based on some form of evidence. But also, from my perspective, we have to adopt what we consider to be a cautious approach. We have to build in buffers, if you like, into the modelling to allow some stress for different market conditions going forward. So just taking some examples. So in the typologies, we've got a density assumption of 35 dwellings per net hectare. Clearly that will fluctuate from site to site when sites come forward, and it may be that higher densities can be delivered, it may be lower densities with larger houses, etc. So we have to make an assumption, but I think there is some flex there on the densities that could help viability. Just wanted to stress as well, I think that we're going to pick up this point later on, but the accessibility and adaptability standard that's in the base typology modelling at the moment is actually more onerous than what the current policy is saying. So we've assumed M43, which is the of the accessibility and adaptability standards. we've assumed that this applies to 13% of the dwellings on a scheme. Well, actually, the council's policy is at 5%. So we've been overly cautious in that assumption in the typology testing. We've also assumed in the modelling the most policies that are available to go into the testing. So, for example, we've got education, we've got open space, we've got the SUDs are in that. We've tried to maximise the policy assumptions in the testing, again, to stress test those. In reality, when each site comes forward, it will be on a site-per-site basis as to whether an education provision is required and the level. So in other words, on the ground, when the individual sites come forward, the level of the policy requirements could be lower, and that would help viability. And then just a couple of quick other points. Profit, I mean, we'll get different views around the room, I know we will. All I can say is from my professional perspective, I think I've been cautious. So the majority of the typologies, so this is the 80, 125, 250 and 500 dwelling typologies, I've assumed a 20% developer profit. The planning practice guidance states that profit should range from 15 to 20% on revenue. So at 20% on revenue for the majority, I've assumed the top end of the range. So in my eyes, that's cautious. And I just, you know, for context, I work with about 50 local authorities across the country, and we do planning stage viability testing, and I do see a range of profit. It's not all 20%, but, you know, we'll see them across that range of 15 to 20%. So again, hopefully just giving the impression of caution and a buffer. The only one that we haven't assumed, the typologies we haven't assumed 20% are the 30 typology and the 10, which are at 18% and 15. And then finally on benchmark land value, this is the bane of all viability assessors. It's very controversial and it's often debated, but again, in my opinion, we've adopted a cautious approach to the allowances. So there's flex within the testing, which we think helps when we're making a decision at the end. So that's hopefully giving you a bit of an overview. So the two questions that I mentioned from the start, the first one is about value zones and about, is it appropriate to have different levels of affordable housing across different areas of the district? And the firm answer from my perspective is yes, absolutely. And that's what the evidence bears out. So in PRE 25, section 6.6, which is PDF page 99, we have a big section talking about residential sales values, new build sales values across the district of South Tyneside. And we test the values in different settlements and different locations. The specific paragraphs for your information are 6.6.4 to 6.6.21. And what that does is it does a couple of things. We look at indexes in the market about how values fluctuate. For example, Rightmove do an index, and so does Zoopla. And it shows you what the average value is in different settlements, you know, whether it's South Shields or whether it's West Bolden. And it tells you, it gives an idea, and those figures are different from settlement to settlement. So that gives us a good understanding that values can and do change across a market, which is to be expected. So that's in there. We also do what's called a beacon assessment, a beacon approach. This is quite useful from a valuing point of view. We get a specific dwelling type, a 3-bed semi or a 2-bed terrace, whatever it may be, and we look at the values of that specific type in different locations, trying to get houses that are as similar as possible to see how values naturally fluctuate for just location factors. So we're trying to distill the difference in value to just location. And what that evidence showed us, and it's in PRE 25, is that values do fluctuate. We have to make a judgment. We have to make a balanced, reasonable judgment as to how that should formulate into policy. And my recommendation to the council was to split it across these 5 value zones. So that was Clevedon, which we consider based on the evidence to be the highest value location. And then we had East Bolden and Whitburn, West Bolden and Bolden Colliery, Hebburn and South Shields and Jarrow. And that's what the map tries to do. It tries to encapsulate all of those different value fluctuations. Clearly, it's not going to be bulletproof. No valuation exercise ever undertaken is 100% black and white. There's always going to be some flex, but we just have to make a reasonable judgment for the purposes of this exercise, which is what we've done. So I'm quite firm on that yes, that is appropriate. And then the second part, which is your MIQ 7.8, are the levels of the affordable housing justified? Yes, so in terms of the context of what I've just tried to spell out to you, we've tried to be quite cautious in the typology testing. So we've kind of stress tested it, if you like. So we think there's some good flex in there. So in that context, even if the viability testing shows an unviable outcome, doesn't mean that actually when it comes to delivery, that level cannot be provided. I'd also just make the point that notwithstanding that comment about the flex and the buffer, the council have adjusted a couple of the policy provisions due to some concerns about the viability outcomes. And it's probably worth just picking up on those very quickly. So when it came to, let me just get my notes. So we've got East Bolton and Whitburn, and I think there'll be a discussion about this. Originally, it was tested at 30% affordable housing. And again, just going back a couple of steps, the latest 2025 testing, just again for context, that is the same as 2023, but all it's changed is the affordable housing mix, because it doesn't have first homes anymore, and it's added in this habitats regulation assessment cost of £760 from memory, or £780 per unit. So it is the same as 2023, just for comparative purposes. So in the 2023 testing, East Bolton and Whitburn was tested at 30%, so we did the same in 2025. And what we found with the outcome of that one was it was viable at 30%, but it was very, very close. And I think when it was that close, it raises a concern in terms of is it appropriate to keep it at that level. And I think the judgment was made that actually a reduction to 25% is reasonable. And also going back to the value zones, the value zones did clearly differentiate between Clevedon and East Bolton and Whitburn. So again, it made sense to have different levels of affordable housing. So that gives you the context. The other one was Hebburn. So Hebburn was tested at 20% affordable housing. You'll note that the policy is now at 15%. So again, the reason for that was because in the Hebburn testing at 20%, it was unviable, but it was close. It was close. So the view was, well, if we reduce the affordable housing provision, that'll help the viability and it'll make it more suitable. So that's why that was dropped to 15%. And just to flag up a final point on South Shields and Jarrow, which is 10%. So this is a bit of a legacy point in terms of the policy, because it was set at 10% originally because the government's wider policy at the time was to have all housing, regardless of viability, to at least deliver 10% first homes or affordable home ownership. And and that policy has run through. But there's a couple of other things just to mention. What we did test in PRE25, so this is the original December 21 testing, is we did a sensitivity test based on low-cost developers delivering in the more challenging value areas, which we consider to include South Shields and Jarrow in this instance. The likes of Gleeson Homes, the likes of Keepmoat Homes, they have a slightly different model to your sort of other house builders, your Red Row or your Barretts or your Taylor Wimpey. And they are able to deliver in more challenging areas, and they are able to deliver affordable housing. So that gave us some comfort that the 10% could still be delivered. So hopefully that gives a quick whistle-stop tour. Apologies, there's lots in there, but feel free to ask away.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. I'll bring in other people. In terms of how that evidence, Mr. Newham, has kind of then been presented in map 22, and we kind of get the different zones for the affordable housing provision. Is that based ultimately on kind of postcode area, or is it by ward boundary? How? I'm just thinking I've had a lot of time at planning inquiries debating about where something sits in relation to the policy says Cleedon, what do we mean by Cleedon? How is this defined? So I don't know if the council can assist on that.
Yeah, so the map is based on ward boundaries kind of put together to make up those areas.
Thank you. And in terms of providing kind of implementation clarity on this, I'm assuming these, I can't recall these affordable housing zones being in themselves on the policies map. I'm imagining that's going to create potentially quite an issue. But I don't know whether just to help the effectiveness of policy part 3, it's clear that when you're referring to those areas, it is as shown on map 22, and that's a cross-reference within the policy. So there's no ambiguity or debate about when we say Cleedon in the policy, what do we mean by Cleedon? I think that's a fairly, hopefully, uncontentious reference. Obviously, I'm mindful that paragraph 34 of the MPPF, and I think Mr. Newham sort of outlined the approach that he's taken, has got to set out the kind of contributions that are expected from development, including affordable housing. It's obviously not to test every scenario, but it shouldn't affect the overall deliverability of the plan, and hopefully is a step away from not having too many discussions around individual kind of site viability considerations, i.e., time is spent at the application stage debating what can be afforded. So it sounds to me that the council's generally taken a precautionary approach where things are marginal, or at the margins of the kind of the individual site locations. Things have generally tipped towards something that's going to be confident, as far as we can be on a modelling exercise, confidently deliverable. But I'm mindful from others that they want a different requirement set out in the policy. So if I can start with East Bolden again, in terms of what you're seeking. I think mindful Mr. Newham has kind of spoke to that to some extent, but I think Mr. Hutchinson first, and then from potentially Mr. Butler as well. I think you're seeking a higher affordable housing requirement for East Bolden.
Yes, thank you, sir. It was really interesting to hear Mr. Newham's background on how the viability figures were arrived at. As you've just alluded, we don't agree with the final figure that has been produced for East Bolden. And I'll go through the reasons why we disagree with that and why we think it should be changed. In the consultation on the draft local plan, we objected to policy 18.34, which stated that that policy wasn't sound. Our proposed modification is that that policy should be amended to obtain 30% affordable homes on new developments in East Bolden. And I'll go on to explain the justification for that. This would return to the position that was set out in the Regulation 18 draft plan when it was proposed that both East Bolden and Cleedon had 30%. And Mr. Newham has given some information on that, which has been quite useful. The decision to reduce it to 25% for East Bolden was difficult to understand because the Strategic Housing Market Assessment 2023 identified a huge increased need for affordable housing from that in 2021. The figure they came up with was 361 units per year as opposed to 209. But it's acknowledged that the Local Plan Viability Testing Update 2023 report recommended the change in relation to national housing market conditions and the level of the Bank of England base rate. However, the report also acknowledges that the local plan viability testing can only be a snapshot of current market conditions. The Bank of England base rate has reduced from 5.25% in June 2023 to 3.75% in 2025, so that clearly changes the position. In our Regulation 19 submission, we pointed out the lack of local justification of the decision in the local plan viability testing update. We also pointed out our view that the site at North Farm in East Bolton would still be highly viable with a 30% affordable homes requirement. Indeed, Mr. Newham, in his presentation, has stated that in the most recent assessment in 2025, East Bolton would be viable at a 30% affordable housing figure, but for reasons of caution, he's chosen to drop it to 25%, which seems illogical to me. The report goes on to conclude affordable housing. Based on our modelling, we consider it appropriate to adopt different levels of affordable housing for different locations across the borough, reflecting the range of market values that are experienced in that locality. Having considered the base worst case testing in terms of applying the maximum policy requirement, as well as the sensitivity modelling, we conclude that the following affordable housing provisions are reasonable. Clevedon, East Bolton, Whitburn 30%. Mr. Newham has explained why that figure is now changed. At these levels of affordable housing, the typologies show that additional policy requirements in relation to biodiversity net gain, electric car charging points, accessibility and adaptability, nationally described space standards, forthcoming changes to building regulations, sustainable draining systems, open space, transport and education can all be viably supported. In conclusion, we consider that those conclusions should still apply and that the percentage for the East Bolton neighbourhood plan area should be amended to 30%. When we consulted the community in the preparation of the neighbourhood plan, we had a huge amount of feedback from the local residents that they needed to have specific accommodation which was suitable for young people and young families to get on the housing ladder, which stay within the local community. If the affordable housing percentage was left at 30%, that would give those people much more of a chance to get on the housing ladder. And it would still be consistent with NPPF paragraph 34. Thank you.
Mr. Butler next, please.
Thank you, sir. I think when we looked at the Regulation 19 plan relating to Clevedon East Bolton, one of the most surprising things was to see the change of level of affordable housing. We had a position of 30%, which covered both villages. And just referring back to map 22, it actually splits the ward. It's not on ward boundaries as such. Clevedon and East Bolton is a ward, has two villages, and the market area at 30% only refers to Clevedon village now. So we have this difference in our communities of the proposal in the plan. And I noticed that Mr. Newham used the word "but very close" to considering 30%. In our view, 30% is more suitable in terms of what's required in paragraph 34 of the NPPF. The local plan viability testing report for the scheme at Landed North Farm East Bolton suggests a 23% profit on a 25% affordable requirement. Therefore, we believe increasing it to 30% would still leave the housing developer with a very viable site. So in our view, we consider it should be necessary for soundness to amend the percentage of affordable housing in East Bolton to 30% to combine that with Clevedon. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move off the East Bolton Clevedon issue, a question to the council. Obviously, pushback there from the local community for an alternative affordable housing figure for the for East Bolton. I'm not saying I am, but if I was minded that that's a modification that is needed to the plan, is that reasonable in terms of the evidence and what's being presented to me, in terms of where things have got to, particularly with the latest 2025 viability update, or are there significant risks were I to recommend 30%?
It's probably worth me just giving a bit of context about why I thought it was too close. So just taking an example, the typology for 125 dwellings, so this is a many £1 million development at 30% affordable housing with all the other policies that were expressed then. The surplus, the viability threshold that it's over is 3.9%, which is £90,000. Now, £90,000 in the context of 125 dwellings is a drop in the ocean. So there is a risk there that will cause problems. Now, they are right in what they're saying. On the technical testing in 2025, it does surpass the viability threshold with the 30% affordable, so I can't dispute that. I think all I'd go back to is we have to make a reasonable judgment as to what we think can be sustained over the lifetime of the plan. And we felt that was 25%, rightly or wrongly. I think the other thing, just to give some context, when the surplus or the deficit is around sort of 15-20% of the viability threshold, that's the kind of area where I start to look at it and think, actually, does this need adjustment? And we've done the same exercise with Hebburn, albeit that Hebburn at 20% was unviable. So we said, let's reduce it to 15%, and that will tip it over that sort of buffer. So again, that's just for context, and hopefully it'll assist.
Thank you. I appreciate it is an element of judgment in this. I think I was perhaps trying to get to whether is 30% an unreasonable kind of position for East Bolden. And what would the risks be? I mean, part of it, part of it could be, well,
I suspect the industry will argue to the contrary. So perhaps if no one's happy, I've got it right. That's what I always think. I can only revert to trying to make a reasonable judgment. Obviously, there's different views.
thank you. I'm going to move. Other people do want to speak. We've still got a fair bit of the agenda to get through. I don't want to sort of artificially constrain discussion, but I'm clear what people are saying to me on East Bolton. If I can hear from others, and if there's time, we'll come back to East Bolton. I'm very clear on what the community is asking for by way of a modification to the plan. I hear what the council's saying. If I can now hear from others, I'll start with Councillor Ford, please, for the Green Party.
Thank you, sir. And may I just crave your indulgence that as a councillor for Clevedon and East Bolton ward, the concern about this is very, very well expressed. And the fact that you yourself raised that the issue of preventing unnecessary arguments at future stage, you know, the fact that this would have a different percentage for two halves of a ward would be quite a risk in itself, I would think, of future the plan not being deliverable in a sensible way. So our overall point is that in terms of your question about are the affordable housing requirements justified in being set at a level that wouldn't undermine the deliverability of the plan, we would definitely argue that yes, they're justified in that, if anything, the requirements would need to be higher in terms of being consistent with the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, the SHMAR of 2023, which, as the East Bolton Forum speaker has said, 361 affordable homes each year across the borough. So I appreciate the explanation of how the figures have been reached, but that is only a snapshot, and the the very high need for affordable housing in the borough means that the targets for the period of the plan should remain robust. There's obviously the plan is subject to reviews. There is the possibility, clearly, of planning applicants submitting viability assessments on individual schemes where viability is deemed to be challenging. But I also would say that the sites in SP7 are seeking to take current greenbelt land out of greenbelt in order to develop as part of the plan. And if they do go forward, then clearly, as the government is minded to try and, in its golden rules for taking sites out of the green belt, that they're, in order to benefit the communities, they're, and to strengthen the housing market, is actually to have higher percentages of affordable housing to be built on those sites. I mean, that's broadly 50%, 15% above existing local policy, which would be up to 40% in our area. So the percentages are clearly not in line with that. Certainly not at 25% for the site in East Bolden. So I think the, clearly the percentages are, must not be lowered, and we would definitely be ideally wishing them to be higher, but I do accept the viability testing, but certainly would make that case. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Kilgore, and then I'll come round the table, please.
Thank you, sir. I think just really quickly to ask that, is our understanding correct that the SP8 is still positioned at 25% requirement for affordable housing, and that hasn't, or there is no intention with regards to viability for that being changed, given that the Jarrow in Hebburn is, or certainly Jarrow is 10%, the site-specific allocation for that is 25%.
Thank you. I'm not aware that the council is proposing any modification in relation to that. The policy is 25%. It's set out obviously within the policy. I'm just looking at the map 22 and the various kind of shading of various shading there, just for clarity. So whilst it sits obviously within the wider sort of 20%, I think the specific policy requirement is obviously for 25. I'm not aware that anybody at this stage, for this purposes of the local plan, I'm keen not to kind of get too further down the track, is suggesting a modification at this stage on the SP8 requirements. Again, I think prefer to come back to that tomorrow, but I'll move on next to Mr. Conroy. We might have something to add on that, please.
Probably took the words out of my mouth with that last sentence, sir. So, yeah, nothing further to add on that one. Thank you.
Okay, so to Mr. Waff and then to Mr. Martin, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Newham may be pleased to hear that Bellway Homes think you have got it right on site GA1, which is obviously the site in Hebburn. Saying that, I have been advised it is still borderline, and obviously this is a site that Bellway did purchase a freehold of almost 15 years ago. However, I spoke yesterday about the unintended consequences of certain policies when we get to planning application stage, and one issue which I think we're kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place here is obviously the December 2024 NPPF, which was mentioned by Councillor Ford, obviously does require at planning application stage for sites released from the Greenbelt to be 15% above a local plan requirement, unless the local plan is being prepared in accordance with the December 2024 NPPF. So what may be an unintended consequence is that the council's evidence indicates that on sites such as GA1 we should be looking at 15% affordable housing. However, I do think there's a risk, based on the December 2024 NPPF being a material planning consideration, that at planning application stage we begin to be requested to provide 30% affordable housing, which, based on the evidence before us, is completely unviable and may prevent sites coming forward.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. I'm not quite sure I follow when you think the risk will be at the planning application stage if the sites, assuming you're going to wait for the local plan to be adopted, the site would then be altered from the green belt.
So there is, I believe it's paragraph 167 of the December 2024 NPPF. If you could please be patient for one moment. Which essentially requires sites which come forward on land which was planning applications which come forward on land which was deleted from the green belt should provide affordable housing 15% above the local plan requirement, unless that local plan has been prepared in accordance with the December 2024 NPPF. So where my concern comes from is we've got an adopted local plan prepared in accordance with the previous version of the NPPF, which stipulates on sites such as GA1, 15% affordable housing. We then get the planning application stage, of which we're then going to have, say, a December 2024 NPPF, which is a material planning consideration, which would direct the local authority to request 15% affordable housing above the local plan requirement, because this local plan is not being examined in accordance with the December 2024 NPPF. So it's perhaps a situation which is maybe unique to South Tyneside at the present time, because we're proceeding in examination of an earlier version of the NPPF, but actually at application stage we're going to have a December 2024 NPPF as a material planning consideration. So I guess where my question, or where the doubt comes from, is actually should sites such as GA1 say that there is a 0% affordable housing, because then in planning application stage that would then jump to 15%, which is what the viability evidence indicates is correct.
Or whether there's potentially another form of future proofing. I'm always reluctant to go down that route. So the potential modification from Mr. Waff is to potentially look at modifying the affordable housing. Your view would be to modify the affordable housing requirements now to factor in, on a practical day-to-day level, the NPPF as a material consideration.
Certainly. So if I may, sir, it's paragraph 156A of the December 2024 NPPF, which I'll paraphrase: where major development involving the provision of housing is proposed on land released from the green belt through plan preparation or review, or on sites in the green belt subject to a planning application. So in some respects it makes no difference whether we wait or don't wait for the local plan, if you like. The following contributions, golden rule, should be made. Affordable housing which reflects either, point 1, development plan policies produced in accordance with paragraphs 67 to 68 of this framework. Clearly that doesn't apply to this development plan because we're not being examined under that. Or point 2, until such policies are in place, the policy set out in paragraph 157 below. And then said paragraph 157, which indicates that we should be 15 percentage points above the highest existing affordable housing requirement, which would otherwise apply to the development. So hopefully you can now see where I think the unintended consequence could come. I do think, obviously I'm not involved in every local plan examination throughout the country, but it may be unique to South Tyneside because of this situation we find ourselves in, that examination under the previous version of the NPPF, at planning application stage, it's December 2024 NPPF, which is a material consideration. So therefore, at face value, the authority would be completely reasonable in saying, well, sites such as Hebburn should be 30%, but saying that the evidence before us now is that only 15% is viable, and that would be a risk of housing delivery, I would suggest.
Thank you. I must admit I'd not followed that through. I understand what Mr. Waff is saying. I appreciate it's not something I recollect reading anywhere in terms of sort of the background material, so it may be something the council's kind of wants to reflect on or think on further.
My immediate reaction is what we can't do is manipulate the plan in order to cater for changes in government policy. That's the first thing. That's my immediate reaction. But the second point is, on the face of it, it does seem to impose a higher requirement in these circumstances, but I want to reflect on it. Just to make sure that my understanding of this is correct in light of what Mr. Wolf has had to say.
Thank you. I'll similarly reflect on it as well. Is there anything further, Mr. Wolf, you wanted to add on the affordable housing?
Just that, for the avoidance of doubt, Bellway do agree with the evidence at 15% for site GA1.
Thank you. Mr. Martin for the House Home Builders, please.
Thank you, sir. It's a bit of a difficult one when looking at viability in this situation from the HBF's point of view. You've got a quite acute affordable housing need, which we discussed at stage 1, 361 dwellings per annum, which is actually over what the overall requirement is, and therefore there is a need there to try and get as much affordable housing away in a viable way as possible to try and meet that need. You've also got a situation here where you've got a small buffer of sites with the sources of supply versus the requirements. So we're in a situation where the council can ill afford sites to sort of slip through the cracks in terms of viability, because it could be quite detrimental to the overall ability of the plan to meet its housing needs. So it all has to be looked at in a very delicate way. The council and Mr. Newham have done the right thing in terms of they engaged with the house building industry from quite early on, and I think that deserves merit, because I go to some examinations and that hasn't been the case at all. So there are various assumptions in there that our members did not agree with Mr. Newham on. Particularly things like some of the residential values, how biodiversity net gain's been treated, and the lack of assumptions for future home standards when they come in. Notwithstanding that, even I think if you look at it on the face of the reports that Mr. Newham's provided, including the 2025 update, which includes the HRA and the allowance for the change in first homes policy, there is a lot of viability pressure in the borough. Going through those topology tables in section 3, there are a lot of topologies that are not just marginally viable, but seemingly quite unviable. I mean, South Shields and Jarrow, I know Mr. Newham referred to that. I mean, some of the topologies you're getting close to 100% deficit on benchmark land value, which is concerning. I appreciate Mr. Newham's talked about flexibility that's sort of built in there in terms of it's made some assumptions which actually are higher policy requirements than actually what's in the plan. I don't know whether it's worth having a viability assessment done which shows shows the viability of those sites with the latest policy requirements. So when you look at the 2025 work, you know, Hebburn is looking unviable, but it's because there's an assumption in there for 20% affordable homes. It's now 15%. So what is the viability situation with 15%? We're being told it's viable, but there's no information there for me to be able to distinguish whether that is the case or not. So there's some unanswered questions from our point of view in terms of the viability of some of the areas in the borough and some of the topologies. And it's how they're then addressed. You can't, whilst the policy has in it a an option for a developer to submit their own viability assessment if viability is an issue on a specific site. That should be the exception rather than the rule. And it's worth highlighting what the PPG says, that where you've got up-to-date policies, it's expected that planning applications can fully comply with that. So that doesn't leave a developer with much in the way of wiggle room for looking at viability. So it's really important that this is done, and it's done robust and it's done correctly. I would like assurances that with the sort of revised M43 requirements, with the drop-in affordable housing, that these sites are viable. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Newman, want to come back on kind of the question mark about some perhaps transparency around some of the latest kind of conclusions.
Just 2 points really quickly. So again, the process is iterative. So we make assumptions about the allowances in the model, and then a judgment is made on it. It doesn't mean that you have to just keep doing viability testing over and over again. There has to be a point where you stop. We did the latest testing. A judgment was made, rightly or wrongly, to reduce Hebburn and obviously East Bolton and Whitburn. Whether it would add anything to the situation to run more testing, because the other problem is, which I alluded to earlier, we can keep testing and putting as many numbers as we want in. We can change the policy so they're lower. We can reduce the profit. We can, change contingency, adjust the M43. We can do all those things, and it will show a viable outcome. But whether that changes the position in terms of the policy, my own view is that doesn't add anything to the process, and that the testing has already been done. It was front loaded in 2021, because we did do some testing at that point where we did some sensitivity testing for half the planning policies. You may have picked up. So our base assessment assumes this full planning policy assumption, and then we did sensitivity testing at 50% of those policy assumptions, and that showed, what he was talking about in terms of viability being a lot brighter. So I stand by the approach undertaken. I understand where he's coming from, but I think it's sufficient in front of you to make the judgment on these policies. Yeah, thank you.
Briefly, Mr. Martin.
Thank you. I've understood what Mr. Newham says, but this local plan has to be based on evidence. It has to be based on robust evidence. I would have expected that once the planning policy requirements and affordable housing requirements have been set by the council, that a final sweep of viability would be done just to definitively prove that those topologies are viable. Because at the moment, I'm looking at section 3 of the 2025 study, and you got the final column, viable or unviable. You've got Hebburn on a number of topologies, and West Bolton on a number, and South Shields on a number saying unviable. If that's tested on a more stringent sort of policy requirement basis, I want to see what it's like on the actual policy requirement basis, just to prove that they are viable. Because at the moment, all I have is the council's word that they've for instance adjusted Hebburn and now it's viable, but I can't see any calculations to show that. Surely you need an assessment, something in writing to show they've gone through that process. I mean, it might be there, it just might not be in these reports.
Thank you. I heard previously from Mr. Newham. We come back to viability next week as well. I'm going to hear further submissions. I'll hold fire in terms of coming to view, I think, on what you're inviting me to kind of consider, Mr. Martin, but that's noted. I want to bring the affordable housing discussion to conclusion and move on to other matters that are on the agenda. Just by way of sort of wrapping up some of the things that have been discussed as part of that sort of various kind of exchanges, I'm going to think on and reflect on further the request or position of the kind of East Bolton community as to whether that should be subject to 30% affordable housing requirements. And if I come to a view on that, that's different to the plan, I'll let the council know through a post-hearings letter. I've noted, Mr. Shadowraven, you're going to, I think, reflect further on what I've heard from Mr. Waff. I don't know if you want further time on that. Or you...
Well, to be honest with you, we've identified this lacuna already, and we have discussed it internally. I've made a submission to you that you should be concerned with the evidence base and what can be supported in this plan, irrespective of the effect that the MPPF may have on that situation at planning control stage, at planning management, development management stage. Having said that, I think it may well be the case that things will change at national policy level anyway, and that this won't be an issue. By the time we get to the MODS process, I think we will know where we stand on that. So I wouldn't actually dwell on it at the moment as an issue, just concentrate on, my respectful submission is, concentrate on what the evidence supports.
Thank you, that's helpful to me. I think it puts in my mind, I'm not going to hear, you've made your submission, I'm not going to hear anything further on that point. That's helpful, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on, please, to item 5 on my agenda, self-build, custom-build housing. Question for the council, that was my MIQ 7.10. In terms of the effectiveness of policy 19, in terms of securing this particular type of housing need. And if memory serves, this is something that is identified, or an opportunity is identified as part of Site SP8 to secure this type of housing product.
Yeah, so it is identified within policy SP8. So in accordance with the MPPF, the council keep a self-build register. There's currently 9 entrants on the register, so it's not a huge demand for it, and there have been no self or custom build housing planning applications in the last 10 years, so I think it's reasonable to assume the demand is quite low. However, obviously it's something that is, it's sort of housing type that is required, so it's captured in policy 19 as well as policy SP8.
Thank you. I think I'd read from other submissions that self-build is not a particularly strong dimension to the housing market in South Tyneside. Mr. Martin?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, it just to pick up on that point, and it was one for clarity on the policy. I wasn't clear whether the policy itself requires larger sites, and larger sites isn't really defined in the policy anyway, to effectively have plots within there that for self-build and custom build, and whether that's a requirement or it's merely something that's encouraged. If it's a requirement, I think that's quite problematic because the demand's quite low. And what you don't want to end up with is development sites with vacant plots for self-build and custom build where the demand simply isn't there. So what do you do with those plots? But it's clarity, and I didn't know what large meant in the context of that policy, and I didn't know whether it's a requirement of those sites or whether it's, if something comes along on those sites, the council are happy to do it.
Obviously the policy is phrased in terms of encouraging that provision. Did the council have in mind what it meant by larger developments? Is it anything kind of major, 10 units or more, or are there particular sites that would, and obviously there's a practical dimension to securing self-build?
Understanding. Over 10 is a threshold, is my understanding.
I think you may be going where I've gone in terms of glossary.
Because if it's not, then we need to bring some definition forward, I think.
I mean, my instinct, I don't know, invite Mr. Martin, seeking self-build on particularly sites down to 10 feels quite difficult.
Yeah.
It could be challenging, whereas larger might apply to a certain threshold. I don't know if the viability study...
Well, I think what we need to do is think about that, actually, rather than sort of offer something immediately, is to think, one, about whether or not in the glossary we need to define the term major, and secondly, what threshold should be applied to self-build.
If there is clarification, Mr. Martin, that would, in my view, be into main mod territory, so you would get an opportunity to comment on that. But you look pained.
Yeah. So, just for my benefit, there isn't the council are not mandating that a large site should give over plots for self-build and custom build. It is just if the opportunity arose, the council would be supportive of it, or is it they are requiring a certain percentage of plots on large sites to be self-built and custom built?
I'd taken it as more the encouragement and sort of positive support given the very low sort of baseline need. Okay. Anything further on custom and self-build? Very briefly, Councillor Kilgore.
So just to say that obviously I know we're struggling with the word mandatory, but I think, you know, if we're talking about large sites, particularly SP8, and I understand that if there isn't the take-up for this type of you know, process, but it should really be considered in more of a way than just encouraged, particularly on the size of that particular site. Whilst I know it's difficult and you can't make someone want to self-build on a particular site, but where it is something that is set out, I think encouraged can't really be put into practice.
Keen not to get too drawn too regularly into the SP8 discussion. I'm just reminding myself of the wording of that particular policy. I mean, that is somewhere where the provision is to be looked at. Obviously, it'll be subject to much further detailed discussion in the fullness of time, but it's in the policy for SP8. I'm going to move on in terms of the agenda. We've touched upon a bit around the mix of housing policy and policy 19 already. I'm not sure there's much further I specifically wanted to pick up or invite the council to speak on that we haven't discussed at previous points. I've just remembered something which is very remiss of me, having moved off affordable housing. The council has obviously looked at and thought about first homes issue. I just wanted to just briefly air that before I get too carried away with other parts of the agenda. I think the council, in reflecting on changes in national policy, is looking at some further modifications in relation to the policies submitted. Obviously looked at first home provision as a product that's no longer kind of mandated, but it can be still pursued. But the council has identified some modifications, as I understand it, to reflect perhaps where we are. And I think as Mr. Newham has indicated, that potentially has some positive ramifications in terms of overall viability.
Yeah, so we've suggested a modification under the response to question 7.9, which essentially removes the need for first homes and reverts to the 10-year split that was evidenced through the SHMA, which would be 75% affordable rent and 25% affordable home ownership.
Mr. Martin, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm happy that with that change to remove that first homes reference in the policy that's been suggested in the council's hearing statement. What slightly confuses me is then that they've put in brackets under affordable home ownership a combination of first home to discount market sales home. So is there still a first homes requirement then? Because they're now saying that that would drop into the affordable home ownership bracket along with discount market value, and neither of them have got a percentage or an amount on there. I think that might need clarification. The other point I wanted to raise looking through the changes is that policy's changed, but the viability assessment, there's a bit of a disjoint between the two. So the viability tests affordable rent and shared ownership, and the policy saying affordable rent and discount market value or first homes. So the tenures are slightly different.
Thank you. If I can just come back briefly to the council on that point, whether there's any clarification needed or whether I should be concerned about the overall viability picture. I don't know. Shall I start with Mr Newham and then come to Ms Cooper on the policy?
Just very, very briefly, just the viability testing has been done, as Mr Martin has expressed, and that's a cautious approach. And if there is the difficulty with discounted market values is that they have higher revenue for the developer. There's also greater risk attached to them because you have to sell them individually like a normal market home. So the profit that's factored into the modelling is higher. So you'd think that just having discounted market sales would have a positive impact on viability, but it's not necessarily the case. So all I can say is the testing is done on the basis that we've undertaken it. So that's affordable rent and shared ownership. My instinct is that if discounted market sale is factored in, it wouldn't hugely change the outcome of the viability modelling as it's shown in there at the moment.
Ms Cooper, in terms of the clarification, I think Mr Martin has suggested might be needed.
Yeah, it was just to say, you know, we'd be happy to sort of relook at that amendment to the policy, and it could just be a case of removing that sort of bit in brackets, which was essentially there just to sort of provide a bit of clarification and assist.
Thank you. I wonder, Mr Martin, whether Mr Newham's response adds to kind of your further point earlier about kind of transparency of completeness of the viability picture.
It was a point I was going to raise, that do we not need a final sweep of the viability that shows all the correct policy requirements just to demonstrate without a doubt that the topologies are viable? I appreciate what Mr Newham says, and Mr Newham may well be right. I wouldn't want to query him, he's the expert, but surely we need something in writing and a piece of evidence to fundamentally show that, rather than just sort of word of mouth.
Indeed. Professional word of mouth.
It was just to add very quickly, I'd like to assure everyone Mr Martin doesn't work for me. I know he's created new business for me and new costs and new work. I will happily do the exercise if you think it's going to add to your decision making.
I think, yeah, qualify that if I think it's needed and necessary. Yep. And the council might have a view on that as well. Oh, right. Okay. On that note, if we can move on, then just I'm going to take sort of items 6 and 7 together in terms of the mix of housing, and we're also sort of into the optional technical standards on accessibility. The final part of policy 19 referred to meeting the needs of the ageing population are accessible to all, and I think the council has thought about a modification to this part of the policy and what's intended. Is that Ms Cooper?
Yeah, so we've suggested a modification to that policy just to remove the are accessible to all bit and to change the ageing population to older people, just to bring that in line with the MPPF.
Thank you. And I'll take two policies relatively closely together. So it's just stay with the council for policy 20 and the various MIQs I had there at 713 and 714 about the justification. These are obviously optional technical standards that councils can bring in above and beyond building regulations. The planning practice guidance sets out kind of various kind of evidential kind of thresholds for introducing such policy requirements, obviously ensuring that they remain kind of viable. I think I heard from Mr. Newham earlier that perhaps earlier testing had assumed higher kind of thresholds, certainly on M43. Again, if I can just invite the council just to very briefly outline the kind of justification for bringing in these particular optional technical standards for the borough and what the council is seeking to achieve, please.
Yeah, so I think as we've picked up on quite a bit this morning, there is a need in the borough for accommodation for older people, accessible accommodation. The SHMA assesses housing stock and condition as well as demographic trends, and it identifies, as we've sort of already discussed, a need for wheelchair accessible homes. I think that's set out in table 5.16 in the SHMA. The SHMA goes on to recommend a policy that requires new homes to be built to accessibility standards, and it suggests a range of between 5 and 10%. Obviously the council have kind of gone with that 5% of new dwellings to be built to M43. And the council's adult social care strategy identifies that 12% of residents have long-term health problems or disabilities, which further just evidences the need for accessible homes.
Thank you. And in terms of the higher M43 wheelchair user requirement, my recollection from the planning practice guidance is that that's for homes where the local authority would have the nomination rights, so they're not to just generally be built on the kind of the open market. Does that need a clarification or a modification somewhere in the plan to make it clear where that higher requirement is going to apply?
Yeah, we have suggested an amendment to the supporting text for policy 20 under question 7.14, which would just clarify that in line with the PPG, the local authority would be responsible for assessing applicants for wheelchair accessible homes and be responsible for nominating residents for those dwellings.
Thank you. So in terms of housing mix and accessible homes as part of that, if I can turn to people on my left and start with Councillor Ford, then I hear from Mr Hutchinson, and I'll come back round to Mr Martin, please.
Thank you. Yes, I do appreciate that there was a potential problem with that part 4 of policy 19 and the council agreeing to remove it. It is a shame because it is a wonderful aspiration to have housing that's accessible to all, and accessible to all should mean that all new dwellings do have the M42, so that they're at least level access and are easy to adapt to make them more accessible, which really is vital, as has been said. The SHMA shows the needs of more and more people, and clearly in our borough that, you know, there are many older houses in the borough that are difficult to adapt and that become unsuitable for people. So I think that the evidence is clearly there. This is a key purpose of the local plan, to meet future needs. So, you know, there are clearly not enough current homes accessible or adaptable, and the need will increase during the plan period. So it's justified that all new homes should be at least M42. Other authorities may not yet be requiring 100% of new homes to be built to this standard, as it is optional, but it's clear that this authority has based their decision to require all new homes to have this basic level of accessibility on sound evidence, and it will meet the identified needs. The second paragraph of Policy 20 is also based on the evidence in the SHMA 2023, the identified levels of disability in the population now and the needs, the demographic trend of our population. So the policy in the plan has taken the minimum percentage of 5%, where the SHMA had identified between 5% and 10% M43 properties a year. And they have limited that to only developments of 50 or more homes. And given the high levels of disability in the borough already, this does seem like too low a target. So we propose that one way of improving that would be to remove that condition of only applying in developments of 50 or more homes. I think particularly as it's now been clarified, the council would be part of nominating who needs that, that all developments should play their part in providing homes that are accessible to wheelchair users. There shouldn't be, it shouldn't be sort of ghettoised into only particular developments. And I think that was all I had to say. Thank you.
Mr. Hutchinson, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just following the discussion on the need for dwellings to be accessible and adaptable, we would fully support that. It allows people to stay in their homes longer by making some sensible design changes. It also reflects the need identified in the SHMA, and without it, it's hard to see how we can respond to the problem of ageing and the need to keep people independent for as long as possible. So I think that's an important point. I'd like to go back to the issue of housing mix, question 6.1, if that's okay. Really, it's about the plan needing to acknowledge the role of the neighbourhood forums in defining what specific housing mix is required in their areas. The housing needs assessment that we carried out when we put together the neighbourhood plan gives a clear indication of the housing mix best suited to the needs of local residents. Reference should be made to the neighbourhood plan within the draft local plan if the needs of residents are to be truly met, rather than East Boldon having to reflect the overall situation within the borough. Experience that we've had from the recent Cleeden Lane planning application suggests that if it's left to developers and market decision making, the needs of local residents in relation to housing mix won't be met. Therefore, the local plan should be more explicit in its requirements in relation to this. Paragraph 7 of the East Boldon Neighbourhood Plan refers to the housing mix identified and states, a key role for the neighbourhood plan is to provide a policy framework to support the provision of a mix of homes to meet local needs. The East Boldon Housing Needs Assessment provides evidence to illustrate the required mix of new homes across the plan area. There are 3 points associated with that. First of all, home ownership is the most common tenure within the plan area, whilst privately rented homes have increased their share significantly between 2001 and 2011. This suggests a rising demand for rented properties, and also that there should be a greater emphasis on delivering homes for private rent and shared ownership. Secondly, there's a lower proportion of one-person households compared to South Tyneside as a whole, and of these, a substantial proportion are aged 65 and over. The recommended housing split for new dwellings is for one-bedroom properties 26%, 2 bedrooms 42%, 3 bedrooms 32%, and for 4 bedrooms 0%. I think that's a very important point to bear in mind for the new developments proposed in the area. Finally, the current provision of specialist accommodation for the elderly is not sufficient to meet the needs of projected elderly population. The neighbourhood plan identified a need to deliver an additional 64 bed places up to 2031. We went into further detail on that particular issue earlier this morning when talking about provision of housing for the elderly. So I think to sum up, we're saying the draft local plan should reflect what was contained within the neighbourhood plan and shape policy so that any sites put forward in the forum area are required specifically to cater for the needs and wishes of its residents.
Thank you. Councillor Kilgour, is that up for this point or previous point? Yep.
Just 2 points, sir, if I may. The 12% that was noted around residents in the borough having a long-term health condition or disability, I wonder if there's been a run at maybe a 7.5 requirement rather than a 5 or a 10. Has that been looked at? And as well, what concerns me in the draft plan is paragraph 8.68, where it suggests that any plans submitted within the 6-month period following adoption would not require adherence to that, and that's what I'm reading it to mean. That would concern me with regards to SP8. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, please.
Thank you, sir. I think in regards to the proposed changes the council put in the hearing statement relating to policy 19 and the mix, I think that provides clarity that we were certainly looking at. I think it's right that applicants should have regard to the SHMA when looking at the housing mix for specific developments. It's not the only consideration that needs to be taken into account. Obviously, there's market considerations, there's the actual site, its location, its context, its constraints. So I'm happy that there's the flexibility in that policy that would allow them to look at all those factors when looking at a mix on site, and not just an assumption that every single site should follow the exact same mix when they come forward. The issue we have is more to do with the M42 requirements. It's obviously 100% at the moment. The PPG is quite clear as to what you need to be looking at. It's a need to have bases, not a nice to have bases. In an ideal world, it would be great if every single house could be M42. That would be fantastic, but there has to be evidence behind it, and that's quite clear. So, and it's not just about need, it's about the size, location, the type, the quality of the housing, whether existing stock can be adapted, whether how that need varies across different tenures, and then also obviously there's the viability implications. Now the SHMA, when I read through it, is very clear on the need. Some of those other points, and I'll get to viability in a minute, but the other points about location, size, the adaptability, etc., the different tenures, I'm not sure it's as clear on that in terms of the evidence. It certainly isn't anything specific in the SHMA that I can see saying these are the relevant tenures, for instance, that we need to be considering this against. The other point I would make is, in terms of viability, it is viability is quite tight in this area. It's an area where you do have to be careful with viability. I note in the 2023 update to the viability assessment, Mr Newham says it may be prudent for the council to revisit its proposed accessibility and adaptability standards. The proposed policy for M42 standard is currently applied to 100% of houses. Given the viability challenges shown in the modelling, the council could consider this in order to aid scheme viability. And it's just interesting as well to compare that figure to neighbouring authorities. So Newcastle is 25%, M42, Gateshead is 25%, Sunderland is 10%, North Tyneside is 50%, Durham is 66%. So it would be an outlier in the area if it were to come forward with 100%. And just because of the margins in terms of viability, I think it would be prudent if potentially a lowered figure would be considered, and it could ease viability pressure. I know that's already been done with M43, but it's whether it could have been done for M42. The other point I would make is regarding the wheelchair accessible point. So that requires the council to have the nomination rights over those properties. What is the situation if the council aren't able to identify somebody to occupy a certain dwelling on a site? What happens to that dwelling? Does it revert to needing to be wheelchair adaptable rather than wheelchair accessible? I just, again, a bit of clarity on that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If I can come back to the council on some of the points that have been raised there. So the first one I wanted to pick up was from Mr. Hutchinson, whether it be necessary under policy 19 to not only cross-refer to the SHMA, but also to cross-refer to other evidence, or technically in terms of the neighbourhood plan, parts of the development plan that could inform specific housing mix.
Earlier on in the plan, particularly under policy SP1, we do require developments to be sort of in accordance and have regard to the neighbourhood plans. Obviously the council have kind of considered that sufficient, but yeah, we can look at obviously an amendment if you think that that's necessary.
No, thank you. I'll reflect on that and I'll look back at that policy SP1 reference. In terms of the optional technical standards and the M42 issue, is it correct, Mr. Newham, that effectively the final viable, if we call it the final viability position, acknowledging it's iterative, does assume 100% M42, and that's a balance with all the other kind of policy requirements?
Yeah, correct, yes. And just to reiterate, so the M42 standard has been assumed at 100% of all dwellings in the modelling, and also the M43 standard has been over-prescribed in the modelling. It's at 13%, not 5%. So the adjustment that's been made in the policy is already going to help the viability.
Thank you. And then finally, does the council have a view in terms of the point made by Mr. Martin in terms of just the practical implications, whether there's anything further that's needed to policy in terms of if that M43 requirement is not fulfilled, what occurs? I mean, I'm assuming, Mr. Martin, that would be resolved or discussed prior to the grant of any kind of planning permission before anything's built or implemented, and kind of factored in at that stage, so there isn't a risk of something going ahead and not meeting a particular need.
I don't know that for certain. I don't know, because you could. It depends when that nomination process comes about, whether it's post signing of a section 106 or pre, and whether, if you are going down this route, it's something that's put in a section 106. It's almost like a cascade or something like that could be done, but it's not clear.
Just to aid me from the council's perspective, and obviously I can look back at the SHMA and other evidence, I mean, in terms of thinking about kind of nomination rights, people with mobility issues who will potentially be placed in the accommodation sorts. I don't know, Ms. Dixon or anyone else who assist on this. I mean, is there any kind of shortage of likely kind of households that would qualify for that type of accommodation? As you sit here now as a kind of council housing manager, is there a strong demand for accessible?
Yes, I mean, just to say that currently on our housing register, the greatest need for people needing to move is because their home is not suitable due to health needs. So although I do appreciate the practicalities, if you know, if you can't match necessarily an individual to the property that's being developed, I don't think there's a shortage of need at this current moment in time.
Thank you. Are there any further points people wish to raise on optional technical standards? There's some points there for me to further reflect on. No. We're coming up to 5 to 1. The only item that's left on the agenda was Gypsy and Traveller provision. Nobody around the table has made representations on this because nobody has made representations on policy 21. There were some points I wanted to pick up, but I think rather my view is, given we had an earlier start, is that I can pick this up with the council probably next week on the final day. We can just briefly go through that policy then, rather than allow people to have a lunch break now, because we've obviously got an afternoon session as well. So can I thank everybody for their contributions as part of this Matter 7 discussion. That was very helpful. Mr. Martin?
Really sorry, sir. Just on the M4 to M43, I know you mentioned in your MIQs about an implementation period. And it was whether that's being discussed at all, because it would be something that we'd be keen to see if it's were to come forward.
Okay, thank you. That's, sorry, I had kind of gone over that. I think the council's response to this is, within the plan there is a reference to a transitional period, which obviously which is what the PPG refers to. Were you anticipating, Mr. Martin, that it's not in the kind of supporting text but is in the policy itself?
No supporting text is fine.
Again, thank you everybody for your contributions this morning. We'll now adjourn this Matter 7 discussion, and I'll be seeing some of you again this afternoon at 2 o'clock for Matter 9, when we pick up climate change, water and health policies for the borough. Thank you.